Hidden within the edges of every world we love, there are questions no one was meant to ask, corners left unlit on purpose, silences that carry more weight than any answer ever could. The Pokemon universe has always been presented as a place of warmth and color, of friendships formed in tall grass and victories earned under bright gymnasium lights. But the longer you sit with its lore, the more those lights seem to flicker, and behind their glow, something older and stranger waits to be seen. These are the mysteries that have lingered for years at the edges of the games and the anime. The unsolved questions that the professors never address, the chapters that the world itself seems unwilling to illuminate. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. There are certain places in the Pokemon world where the air feels different, where the music shifts to something slower and more uncertain, and where the sense creeps in that something profound has been left unresolved. It is in those places where the most unsettling truths reside, not in the roar of legendary Pokemon, but in the silences between events, in the absences no one acknowledges, in the figures who vanish without explanation, and the structures that stand as monuments to grief no one wants to name. One of those absences has always centered on the empty chair at a breakfast table in Pallet Town. For more than 25 years, across every season the anime has aired, Ash Ketchum's father has remained a ghost. Not in the fantastical sense the world of Pokemon is so comfortable with, not a wandering spirit or a creature born from tragedy, but something quieter and perhaps more unsettling than all of that. A human absence, a deliberate void. Ash's mother Delia moves through her days with the practiced calm of someone who long ago made peace with a wound she refuses to name aloud. There are no photographs of the man on any mantle, no stories whispered over dinner, no letters that arrive from distant towns, just the empty chair and the boy who left at 10 years old, propelled forward by a fire that has never quite found a place to rest. This is where we begin our descent tonight, into the darkest unsolved mysteries of the Pokemon world, the questions that have haunted players and viewers for decades, the stories that no official guide will ever fully explain. Some are born from tragedy, some from war, some from grief carried so long it has transformed into something that walks and breathes and wanders the world, still looking for what it lost. Let the questions settle over you now. Let the darkness carry them gently, and let us move together through these quiet, disturbing corners of a world that has always been stranger than it first appeared. There is something particular about the kind of absence that is chosen rather than suffered. A death leaves behind evidence, a grave, a story, a name carried forward in the way a child tilts their head or laughs. But an absence that was chosen, one where a person simply did not return and was never explained, leaves something harder and less speakable behind. That is what Ash Ketchum carries, not a tragedy with defined edges, but a void without any borders at all. Delia Ketchum raises her son alone, and she does it with such warmth and consistency that it would be easy to overlook the strangeness of the arrangement entirely. She waves goodbye with a smile. She cheers from the sidelines during league broadcasts. She is, in every conventional sense, a devoted mother. But she never explains where his father went. She never mentions his name in passing. She never references him as someone who once existed in their lives and then departed. He is not mourned. He is simply not mentioned, which is a different and more unnerving thing entirely. Producer Masamitsu Hidaka, who worked closely with the Johto era of the anime, revealed in later interviews that there had indeed been plans to address this mystery during the arc corresponding to the spell of the Unknown film. An entire storyline had been developed, one that would have given Ash's father a face and a history, and a reason. That storyline was set aside, and the reason Hidaka offered was both simple and strangely poignant. The father had not died, he had chosen to leave. He was a trainer whose life on the road had consumed him, and who had made the decision, consciously, to remain away from a home and a family he believed would be better without the disruption of his presence. What that revelation suggests is more troubling than any simple tragedy would have been, because it means that somewhere in the Pokemon world, a man is still walking, still moving from town to town, from route to route, collecting experiences while his son collects gym badges with the same restless urgency. There is something in the way Ash pushes forward, in the way he never quite settles, never quite accepts a resting place, that carries the echo of that absent figure. Not grief, exactly, something less defined and more pervasive. The drive of a boy who has been quietly racing toward a reunion he doesn't even know how to name. Fans have threaded theories through every season of the anime, searching for the ghost of this man. Ash dreams of a cloaked figure early in the series, someone whose features dissolve before they can be identified. Delia deflects with practiced ease whenever the subject approaches, her eyes going somewhere distant before she redirects the conversation toward food or Pokemon or the weather on Route 1. These moments feel too deliberate to be accidental, too consistent across 20 years of storytelling to be simple oversight. Someone, somewhere in the production of this series, has always known exactly why that chair is empty. They simply chose never to say so aloud. The weight of that unacknowledged absence settles differently once you understand that Pokemon is a world where the consequences of training are rarely spoken aloud. Lieutenant Surge, the Vermilion City gym leader, is one of the few characters in the entire series who references a conflict with any specificity at all. He fought in a war. He survived because his Pokemon saved his life. His manner, abrasive and direct, and carrying the kind of hardness that only forms around genuine trauma, suggests that whatever conflict he lived through was not the kind of adventure the games typically present training to be. And that war, the one Surge references and the games never fully explain, is one of the most persistent and unsettling absences in the entire canon. It is mentioned in fragments, implied in Pokédex entries, felt in the ruins and the burned towers and the fortified structures that exist without explanation across multiple regions. But it is never named, never dated with precision, never given the weight it would seem to deserve. A war was fought somewhere in the history of this world. Pokemon were used as weapons within it, people died, and then the world moved on and covered it in bright music and gym leader quips and the cheerful assumption that none of that history needs to be examined too closely. Ash's father, whoever he is, existed in that world. He was a trainer in a world where training and warfare have always shared a blurry and unexamined boundary. The fire that propels Ash forward, that relentless insistence on becoming stronger and moving always toward the next challenge, carries within it the unmistakable quality of someone running toward something they cannot clearly see. Perhaps toward a man, perhaps toward an understanding of who they themselves are, perhaps toward a question that the Pokemon world has decided, with great care and great quietness, never to answer directly. There are creatures in the Pokemon world whose very existence is built around grief, and none of them carry that weight more visibly than Cubone. It walks upright, small, and fragile through roots and caves, and on its head it wears a skull. Not a decorative helmet, not a symbol chosen from some cultural tradition. A skull worn as a mask that the Pokédex entries across multiple generations confirm belongs to its own mother. Cubone wears its mother's remains, and it weeps inside that shell, tears soaking the bone, every night, calling out for the one who can no longer respond. The question of where that skull came from has haunted Pokemon lore since the original games, because Cubone does not evolve from any creature that resembles it. It evolves into Marowak, a creature that wields a bone club with fierce protectiveness and whose Pokédex entries note that it still mourns the mother it never properly knew. There is no parent Pokemon in the line. There is no egg that is laid by something which clearly precedes Cubone in the manner that most species in the game establish their origin. There is simply the small creature and the skull it came into the world already wearing, as if the grief were the beginning and not an event that happened along the way. The most widely discussed theory, and the one that carries the most weight when held against available evidence, connects Cubone to Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan is the large maternal Pokemon who carries her young perpetually in a protective pouch, whose entire identity as a species is built around the fierce and unwavering act of protection. Her young ride within her, peeking out at the world from that safe enclosure, and the relationship between mother and child in this species is among the most visible and warmly presented in the entire franchise. And yet, if something were to happen to that mother, if she were to fall in the wild to a predator or a poacher or the simple cruel fact of mortality, the small creature left behind would find itself suddenly in possession of a skull and without the language to grieve anything except through wearing what remains. What makes this theory so quietly devastating is that the game never confirms it. It doesn't need to. The evidence accumulates across generations in small, careful fragments. The Crystal version Pokédex notes that female Cubone produce only one offspring, a detail that heightens the weight of every individual loss within the species. The original Fire Red entry mentions that Cubone refuses to remove the skull even during sleep, because glimpsing its own face beneath the mask would shatter what remains of its fragile stability. And the Gold and Silver entries note that Cubone appears more frequently during rainstorms, as if the weather itself summons its grief back to the surface. Marowak evolves the tragedy further without resolving it. In the original Red and Blue, a ghost haunts the upper floors of Lavender Tower, a spirit that cannot move on and blocks the path forward until it is acknowledged and put to rest. That ghost, the lore strongly implies, is a Marowak whose life ended before its time, leaving behind a Cubone somewhere in those same halls, weeping alone into a skull that still carries the warmth it has slowly been losing ever since. The image does not fade easily. A child, wearing its mother, inside a tower built specifically to house those who cannot leave. The Alolan form of Marowak complicates this further. In Alola, Marowak channels the flames of its grief into something spectral and deeply strange, its bone blazing with the blue-white fire of a spirit that never fully departed. The loss has been metabolized into power, but not peace. The fire burns because something refuses to go out, because something in the lineage of this creature insists on holding what cannot be held. Alolan Marowak dances in the dark, spinning its bone in ceremonial arcs that the Pokédex describes as a ritual to honor the dead, which is to say that the entire species has built a culture around mourning what it can never recover. That is a disturbing and deeply melancholy thing to hold. There is another quiet detail that surfaces when you look closely at Cubone's place in the broader ecosystem of the Pokémon world. It lives in caves and rocky terrain, places that carry the character of endings rather than beginnings. The roots where it is most commonly found are not the bright meadows of early game areas, but the deeper, more shadowed passages that arrive once the player has already grown familiar enough with the world to begin to sense its weight. Cubone lives in the margins, in the places the cheerful surface of the game does not quite reach. And it carries its grief there, visibly and without apology, in a way that nothing else in the franchise quite mirrors. Mega Kangaskhan, introduced in the 6th generation, offered a strange echo of this unresolved question. Her mega evolved form pulls the pouch baby forward into battle alongside her, the small creature fighting alongside its mother, in a way that feels both tender and slightly alarming given the implications of the lineage theory. The mechanics of it suggest that the bond between Kangaskhan mother and child is something deeper and more interdependent than the game typically acknowledges. And when you hold that against the image of Kubon alone in a cave, wearing what the Kangaskhan can no longer use, the contrast becomes very difficult to look away from. Every swing of Kubon's bone club echoes something. Every cry that rises from within that mask is asking a question the world will not answer. That is perhaps the most honest and most quietly unsettling thing about this particular corner of Pokemon lore. Not that the tragedy is unusual or extreme, but that it is so ordinary in its shape. A child losing a parent, a creature carrying what remains, a species built entirely around the act of not letting go. In a world of legendary Pokemon capable of reshaping time and matter, this small ground type wandering a cave in a skull is somehow the most haunting thing of all. There are mysteries in the Pokemon world that arise from things that happened, and there are mysteries that arise from things that were planned and then quietly set aside. The second kind carries a particular quality of unresolved longing, because somewhere inside it is the ghost of a story that almost existed, a narrative thread that was pulled through the fabric of the fiction and then cut before it could be tied. The GS ball is the most famous of these loose threads, and its story says as much about the nature of creative decisions as it does about the nature of the Pokemon world itself. During the Johto arc of the anime, Ash came into possession of a mysterious Pokeball unlike any other. Its surface was gold and silver, weighted with an unusual density that Kurt, the master craftsman of Azalea Town, described as unlike anything he had ever examined in decades of working with Pokeball construction. The ball hummed with a quality that resisted easy explanation. It could not be opened. It could not be analyzed by any standard method. And it carried within it the sense suggested across multiple episodes, something that was waiting. Episode after episode, the GS ball was treated as a significant object. Team Rocket pursued it. Characters referenced it in ways that implied they understood its importance, even if they could not explain it. Kurt kept it in his workshop, studying it, and each time Ash or Misty asked for an update, the craftsman responded with the same measured vagueness, that he was making progress, that this required extraordinary care, that something this unusual could not be rushed. The audience waited. The anticipation built in the way that genuine mystery builds, not through any single dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small, careful suggestions that something important was approaching. And then it stopped, not with an explanation, not with a resolution, not even with a formal acknowledgement that the thread was being set aside. The GS ball simply ceased to be referenced, and the Johto arc moved forward as though it had never existed. For nearly a decade, from the late 1990s into the mid-2000s, the mystery sat unresolved in the memory of every viewer who had been paying attention, an itch the show never scratched. The answer, when it finally came, arrived not through the anime but through an interview. Masamitsu Hidaka, the same producer who had spoken about Ash's father, revealed in 2008 what the GS ball had always been meant to contain: Celebi, the time-traveling guardian of the forest, the small mythical Pokemon whose relationship with time is portrayed across its appearances as something both gentle and deeply consequential. An entire arc had been planned, one in which Ash would have chased temporal echoes of his own journey through distorted forests and crumbling ruins, guided and pursued by a creature that existed in multiple moments simultaneously. The arc was abandoned because of a film. Pokémon Forever, released in 2002, claimed Celebi for its theatrical story, and the decision was made that the mythical Pokemon could not appear in two significant narratives simultaneously without diluting the impact of both. The anime script was shelved, the storyboards were folded away. Kurt's workshop fell silent on the matter, and the GS ball was left in the continuity, like a room with the doors sealed shut, present and unreachable and impossible to ignore once you knew to look for it. What the GS ball represents beyond its specific contents is something broader and more interesting. It is evidence of the way that Pokemon's stories accumulate meaning through what is withheld rather than what is shown. The ball carried weight not because of what it contained, which no viewer knew at the time, but because of the way it was treated, the way it changed the air in a room, the way it made experienced characters hesitate, the way it implied that some objects in this world are beyond the ordinary categories that govern everything else. That quality of implication, of meaning held just out of reach, is what makes the unsolved mysteries of the Pokemon world so persistent. They are not gaps in the narrative. They are rooms that were deliberately built and then sealed. And the sealed door is the point. The fan response to the GS Ball's true origin was when it finally arrived, a strange mixture of satisfaction and grief. Satisfaction because the mystery had an answer after all these years, because Celebi as a response made elegant sense, because the planned arc sounded genuinely beautiful in its ambition, and grief because it was an arc that never aired, a story that came close enough to existence to have been storyboarded and scripted and then reclaimed by the machinery of production decisions before it could reach the audience for whom it was being made. Somewhere in the files of the anime production, those storyboards still exist. Scenes of Ash chasing fragments of time through warped forests. Celebi's spiraling form, weaving through the moments of a journey that had already happened. The GS ball finally opening, finally releasing what it held, finally allowing the weight of all those episodes of waiting to resolve into something, and none of it aired. That is the particular melancholy of this mystery. Not that the answer is unknown, but that the story through which the answer would have arrived was set aside before it could become the thing it was meant to be. In Ecruteak City, which lies in the heart of Johto, like a knot of old stories gathered too tightly to easily unravel, there is a tower that burned. It stood for centuries alongside its twin, the Tin Tower, both structures reaching into the sky as landmarks of a specific kind of reverence, places built to honor the relationship between the legendary and the living. The Tin Tower still stands, attended by the sacred Pokemon Ho-Oh in certain moments, carrying the dignity of what it was built to embody. The Brass Tower is a ruin. Its beams are charred. Its walls have partially collapsed. It sways in the wind like something that has been standing out of stubbornness rather than structural soundness, and the very air around it feels different from the air in the rest of the city. The fire that destroyed the Brass Tower is one of the most referenced and least explained events in all of Johto's history. Elders speak of it. The Kimono Girls honor its memory in their dances. The lore suggests that the fire was catastrophic and sudden, and that it came from either human folly or natural violence, though neither cause is ever confirmed. Some accounts whisper of a ritual gone wrong in the deep hours of the night. Others point to a storm, lightning finding the dry thatch of ancient timbers during a season when the weather turned violent without warning. The games offer fragments, but no resolution, and that irresolution is part of what gives the event its ongoing weight. What the lore does confirm is that 3 Pokemon were inside the tower when it burned. They were not legendary creatures. They were not special in any way that the records preserve. They were ordinary inhabitants of Johto's misty paths, drawn into the structure by some instinct or loyalty or simple circumstance, and they perished when the tower fell around them. Their deaths were real, and they were complete. Bodies reduced to ash, alongside the tower's sacred relics, their individual identities absorbed into the general catastrophe of the event and then forgotten. The lore does not name them. It does not describe what kind of Pokemon they were before the fire, whether they had trainers, whether they had come to the tower willingly, or been caught in something they did not understand. They are defined entirely by their ending and by what that ending produced, because Ho-Oh was watching. The rainbow winged phoenix, whose Pokédex entries across multiple generations describe as a creature that has witnessed the full cycle of the world's destruction and renewal, that circles above the most profound moments of loss with the patience of something that has always known this was coming. It descended through the smoke. It looked at what remained of three ordinary lives extinguished before their time, and it used its divine power to do something that the living world almost never permits. It brought them back. What rose from those ashes was not a restoration. It was a transformation so complete that the creatures who had died and the creatures who returned were separated from each other by the full distance between ordinary existence and something that transcends it. Raikou emerged from the one who had been touched by lightning in the blaze, its mane a perpetual storm, its body rebuilt around the electricity that had killed it. Entei rose from the heart of the fire itself, volcanic and ferocious, a creature whose roar shakes mountains as though it is perpetually trying to reignite something it can feel slipping away. And Suicune glided out of the purifying rain that followed the catastrophe, crystalline and northern, and driven by an urge to cleanse what the fire corrupted, that it can never fully satisfy, because the ashes it is trying to wash away are its own. They roam now, these three. Pokédex entries describe their endless movement with a consistency that begins to feel less like a behavioral pattern and more like a compulsion. Raikou races through thunderheads, pursuing the spark it held so briefly before it was extinguished. Entei bounds across smoldering terrain, hungering for the warmth of a world unburned. Suicune drifts over poisoned streams and contaminated lakes, cleansing with its passage what fire and grief have left behind, though the entries note with quiet sadness that its own spectral thirst is never quenched by any of this work. They were given immortality, and immortality was given in the shape of the event that destroyed them. They carry the brass tower's fire with them forever in the bodies they now inhabit. The question of what those three Pokemon were before the fire has never been answered, and the deliberateness of that silence is worth sitting with for a moment. The games that take place in Johto, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver in particular bring the player to the burned tower's interior and allow them to stand in the space where those unnamed creatures perished. The air is thick with something, static electricity, and the residual heat of a fire that burned long ago, and the particular quality of places where significant things happened and the significance was never fully processed. You can encounter the beasts within that space, Raikou and Entei and Suicune manifesting briefly before vanishing again into the wider landscape. But you are never told who they were. The anime offered glimpses. In certain Johto episodes, shadowed forms are seen fleeing the burning structure in the distant past of the narrative, creatures caught in the chaos whose features dissolve before they can be identified. Even here, with the visual medium available and the emotional resonance clearly understood, the decision was made to withhold the faces. What they were before they died is not the point the story wants to make. What they became afterward is. And yet the gap remains, because we are the kind of creatures who want to know not just the transformation, but the thing that was transformed, who want to hold the name of what was lost before we can fully understand the shape of the loss. The brass tower stands in the rain at the edge of Ecruteak City, and it will not stop swaying. And somewhere across the plains of Johto, three souls that should have found rest are still moving, still racing and roaring and purifying, still carrying within their redesigned bodies the echo of a night that the world cannot bring itself to fully name. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. There are encounters in the Pokemon games that carry a different quality from everything surrounding them. Moments where the usual grammar of the game's interaction breaks down and something enters that does not follow the expected rules. The Ghost Girl of Lumio City is the most widely reported of these encounters in the sixth generation, and she has never been explained by any official source in the years since Pokemon X and Y were released. Not in interviews, not in supplementary lore documents, not in the games that followed. She appeared, she spoke, and she has since been treated by the series with the same deliberate silence it applies to its most unsettling corners. The encounter occurs in a specific building in the city, in an upper floor reached by elevator. The player steps out, and the game's normal rhythms immediately change. The music does not play. The floor is empty, and then she appears, a pale figure in a simple dress whose feet do not quite touch the ground, who circles the player with a slow and deliberate motion that carries none of the energy or animation of the game's normal characters. She looks at the player's face with an intensity that the game's visual language reserves for significant moments. And then she speaks four words that have been echoing through the community ever since. You're not the one. She dissolves into the air. The room returns to its normal state. No explanation is offered by any NPC, no journal entry, no piece of scenery that might contextualize what just happened. Trainers across the world encountered the same figure in their playthroughs, always in the same building, always with the same hovering approach and the same hollow assessment and the same abrupt departure. The consistency of the experience across different players eliminated the possibility of a simple glitch. This was deliberate. She was placed there deliberately, and whoever she is looking for, whatever one she has been seeking through the elevator shafts of a glittering metropolis, the game's creators chose never to reveal. The Kalos region, where Lumiose City exists, is presented as the brightest and most architecturally sophisticated of the Pokemon regions, a world of light and fashion and scientific ambition. The Ghost Girl exists in profound contrast to all of that. She does not belong to the city's aesthetic or its energy. She belongs to something older and more mournful, to the layer of the world that lies beneath the bright surfaces, the one that contains the war, the loss, the unnamed dead. And the fact that she searches so persistently for a specific person, returning to this building across multiple encounters with different trainers, dismissing each one with the same quiet certainty, suggests that whoever she seeks was real, that the relationship between them was specific and deep enough to persist beyond whatever ended her ordinary existence. What makes her reappearance in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire particularly striking is the location. She manifests again on Mount Pyre, which is a mountain in Hoenn built specifically as a memorial site for deceased Pokémon and the humans who loved them. The air on Mount Pyre hums with a particular quality that the game captures carefully, the unresolved energy of things mourned but not yet released. Hex maniacs murmur prayers to the flames that burn there eternally. And in the middle of this space designed entirely for the processing of endings, the Ghost Girl from Lumio City appears again, gliding across the stone platforms, looking out toward the horizon, repeating the same assessment with the same precision. You're not the one. She crosses regions. She moves through the architecture of grief. She searches with a consistency that suggests she knows exactly what she is looking for and has simply not yet found it, which means it still exists somewhere in the world, either among the living or among the dead of Mount, Pyre's eternal company. Who she's looking for has generated more sustained speculation in the Pokemon community than perhaps any other single mystery in the franchise's history. A lost trainer from the Great War, a soul fragmented by one of Kalos's catastrophic events, a scientist from the power plant that borders Lumios's electric heart, someone absorbed into an experiment that left behind nothing but this searching remnant. The Kalos power plant's locked rooms, corridors sealed behind doors that no key in the game will open, have been part of the same conversation, chambers that hum with energy no one has been permitted to examine. No later game has brought her back. No official source has named her or named what she seeks. She fades into the conversation around Kalos's abruptly concluded narrative arc, a story that seemed to be building towards something significant and was instead set down before its most important questions could be answered. She is a sentinel of limbo, moving between the city of light and the mountain of the dead, searching for the one face that will finally let her rest. And she has not found it yet. Deep in the mountains of Kitakami, a region attached to Paldea and presented through the Teal Mask expansion as a place where folklore and reality have never been fully separated, there exists a creature that cannot be explained by ordinary evolutionary biology. The blood moon Ursaluna is not simply a variant of the Ursaluna found in the ancient Hisui region, the large earthy bear that evolved through connection to the soil and the full moon's gentle influence. The blood moon form is something that happened to an Ursaluna rather than something it became through the normal processes of growth and transformation. And what happened to it was the result of human interference in forces that the people involved were not equipped to understand. The people of Kitakami speak of the Akama no Noroi, the curse of the red pine moon, as though it is a historical fact and a persistent danger simultaneously, the kind of event that occurred long ago and has not fully stopped occurring. Under specific lunar conditions, during what they call the blood moon, an atmospheric phenomenon where lunar eclipses, stained by volcanic ash in the upper air, turn the sky a deep arterial red, certain Pokémon can be forced through a transformative process that the traditional evolutionary system was never meant to accommodate. The transformation is driven by objects called secret keys, evolutionary items whose origins the game describes as shrouded in taboo, passed down through isolated clans who lived in Kitakami's most remote elevations and who performed rites with these objects under the blood moon's influence. The secret keys were not simple stones or catalysts in the manner of evolution items elsewhere in the franchise. They were, the lore suggests, fragments of ancient alchemy developed during the turbulent era of the Hisui region, during the period chronicled in legends, Arceus, when the Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan competed for dominance over the land, and both were willing to experiment with evolution in ways that blurred the line between augmentation and violation. These fragments were harvested from places the game describes with careful vagueness, from meteorite peaks and the remains of extinct beasts, and they carried within them an energy that does not originate in the natural process of growth. The Ursaluna that became the blood moon form was, the lore implies, isolated, cut off from its migratory companions by the avalanches and perpetual storms that sealed Kitakami's highest reaches from the rest of the world. Alone and disoriented, and perhaps the last of a line that had once moved freely through the lowlands, it consumed one of these keys during a cataclysmic night under a blood moon. And what happened to its body was not evolution. The Pokédex entries from the Teal Mask describe a transformation at the cellular level, fur hardening into thorned plates, veins pulsing with luminescent red, the creature's roar reshaping itself into something that mimics the ancient dirges the Kitakami shamans sang at their most desperate rituals. What the blood moon Ursaluna represents beyond its specific origins is the concept of evolution used as a weapon, or as a desperate measure, or as a ritual whose consequences were not fully understood by the people who performed it. The Pokemon world has always treated evolution as something fundamentally positive, a process of becoming more fully what one already is, of growth and expansion and transformation toward a more complete state. The blood moon form breaks that assumption quietly and completely. There is nothing complete about this creature. It is enormous and territorial and capable of violence that its normal form would never enact, but it is not more fully itself. It is something that happened to a self that was already whole, something that rewrote the creature from within without asking whether the creature consented to being rewritten. Eyewitness accounts preserved in Kitakami's folklore describe the blood moon Ursaluna as moving with unnatural silence for its size, as if the mass of it occupies a different relationship to the physics of the world than ordinary creatures do. It claims entire ridges as territory, marking boulders with claw scars that glow under the moonlight that transformed it, a warning that the lore translates roughly as an announcement that this land is cursed and its protector is eternal. Not powerful, not dominant, eternal. The choice of that word is deliberate and carries the same quality of melancholy that attaches to all the creatures in the Pokemon world who were given something they cannot set down. The Blood Moon, Ursaluna, is the last of its kind. Its isolation was complete before its transformation and remains complete afterward. There is no herd for it to return to, no companions who recognize what it became or remember what it was before. It patrols its mountain territory alone, under skies that occasionally turn the color of the ritual that made it what it is, carrying within its transformed body the full weight of an event it never chose and a condition it cannot change. In this, it resembles many of the creatures in this survey of Pokemon's darkest corners. Not the monsters of the franchise, who are frightening in simple and comprehensible ways, but the ones who were made into something by forces beyond their control and who must continue to exist in the shape those forces imposed upon them. In the ancient history of the Unova region, before the cities were built, and before the gyms were established, and before the landscape took on the urban character it has in the 5th generation games, two brothers stood together on the highlands with a dragon Pokemon of extraordinary power. They had raised it together. They had cared for it together. The dragon had grown in response to their bond until it reached a scale and a power that the world at that time had never seen. And then the brothers disagreed about how the world should be. One brother believed in truth, in the value of things as they actually are, stripped of illusion and sentiment, understood clearly and completely, even when that understanding is painful. The other believed in ideals, in the value of things as they should be, in the vision of a world shaped toward justice and beauty and the highest aspirations of both humans and Pokemon. These are not simple positions. They are not obviously right or wrong in the way that the franchise's antagonists usually are. They are two genuine ways of seeing the world, two orientations toward reality that exist in real tension with each other and that have animated real disagreements between real people for as long as people have been able to articulate the difference between them. And the dragon, which had been raised on the bond between the two brothers and which drew its power from that bond, could not survive its dissolution. When the brothers' disagreement hardened into something that could not be reconciled, when the truth and the ideal pulled in directions that the dragon's single body could not simultaneously honor, it did something extraordinary and terrible. It divided itself. The dragon that had been one creature became three. Reshiram rose in the flames of truth, white and austere, and burning with the fire of what is. Zekrom plunged into the shadows of ideals, black and immense, and crackling with the electricity of what should be. And Kyurem remained, the hollow shell left behind, of the body from which both aspects had departed, wandering the frozen north of Unova, in a state that the Pokédex entries describe with a quietness that makes the description more unsettling rather than less. It is an empty vessel. It awaits the return of what left it. It exists in the space between what was and what might be and carries, in its hollow chest, the cold of everything that was lost when a bond became a disagreement, became a fracture. The Pokédex entry for Kyurem in black and white describes it as having an energy that has been frozen over. It cannot use its power fully because its body was not designed to be only what it now is. It was designed to be complete. What it is now is the remainder, the part that did not map onto either truth or ideals, the part of the bond between two brothers that could not be assigned to either side of their conflict and was therefore left to wander alone in the cold without even the clarity of belonging to a position. That is a profoundly specific kind of grief. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of having been the part of something that the something could not take with it when it divided. Generations N and Ghetsis, in the events of the 5th generation games, interact with these three dragons in ways that amplify the tragedy without resolving it. N is a young man raised on the ideal that Pokemon and humans cannot coexist without harm to the Pokemon, that the training relationship is fundamentally exploitative, that the only honest response to this understanding is to separate the two species entirely. He is wrong, and the game makes a compelling argument for why he is wrong, but he is not dishonest, and he is not cruel, and his position emerges from genuine suffering and genuine care. He is someone who looked at the world with the same intensity that the first brother looked at it, and was as unable to live with what he saw as that first brother was. Kyurem still waits in the giant chasm, its chest still hollow. The dragon that divided itself to end a conflict between two brothers has never been made whole again, and the lore does not suggest that wholeness is possible through any means that the players can access. The fracture that happened in the ancient highlands of Unova was too deep, the separation too complete. What was one is now three, and the three cannot be what the one was, because the one was built on a relationship that no longer exists. 3,000 years before the events of Pokemon X and Y, a king ruled over what would become the Kalos region. He was an ordinary kind of extraordinary, the type of ruler whose power and intelligence are evident, but whose history becomes remarkable only when grief enters it. His name was Azed. He was very tall, in the way that legends often are in Pokemon lore, when the narrative wants to mark them as different from ordinary experience without explaining the difference directly. And he had a Flabébé, a small fairy-type Pokemon, whose flower it carried like a shield, and whose loyalty to the king was total in the way that Pokemon loyalty is when it is given without condition. The war that consumed Kalos 3,000 years ago is described in fragments across the 6th generation games and lore. It was vast. It involved kingdoms fighting over territory and power, and the kinds of things that wars between kingdoms have always been fought over. And the Pokemon were used in it, not as companions, not as partners whose well-being was considered alongside the military objectives, but as weapons deployed and spent and replaced with the same calculation applied to any other material resource in a conflict of that scale. The war's specific details remain vague, but its emotional fact is clear. It was catastrophic. It consumed things that should not have been consumed, and at some point during it, the small Flabébé who had been the king's most cherished companion vanished into the chaos. Azza searched. Weeks became months. The war continued around his searching, and he could not stop it, and could not find her, and could not accept that these two facts would simply remain alongside each other indefinitely. Grief, when it reaches a certain depth, begins to look for something to do with itself. AZ turned his toward engineering, drawing on forbidden knowledge obtained from scholars and alchemists whose ethical frameworks had not survived contact with the desperation the war had produced. He designed and built what the game calls the ultimate weapon, drained the life energy from Pokemon, and drained the life energy from Pokemon, and converted that energy into a beam capable of ending any conflict by ending everyone involved in it. He used it. The beam fired. the kingdoms crumbling under its light, ended not through negotiation or surrender, but through simple erasure. Hundreds of thousands of lives, soldiers and civilians, and Pokemon who had been drafted into a conflict they had not chosen, reduced to ash in a flash that the game describes as tearing the sky apart. The war ended. The rival armies were gone. Kalos was victorious and hollow in the same moment, the victory consisting entirely of the absence of what had been defeated. And then, in the specific cruelty that seems to attach to moments of maximum consequence in the Pokemon world, his Flabébé returned, battered and flower wilted, alive. She came back on the day he believed he was winning, when the weapon's first deployment had already been decided and carried out, when the decision that could not be unmade had been made. She returned with unwavering loyalty to find a king who had unmade the world to find her. His embrace of her in that moment was so complete, so overwhelming in its relief and its horror, that it accidentally triggered the weapon's activation again. The second firing consumed what the first had left, and AZ survived because the weapon's energy coursed through him as it discharged and granted him something no person should be given as a consequence of their worst act. He became immortal. Immortality in the Pokemon world is not the gentle gift it occasionally appears to be in other mythologies. It is a condition imposed on a person who has done something that cannot be undone and must therefore continue to exist alongside the knowledge of it indefinitely. A Z wandered Kalos and beyond for 3,000 years, carrying both the memory of the weapon and the continued presence of the small Pokemon who had healed him with golden pollen for centuries before. At last, she could no longer bear what he was becoming. Flabébé evolved into a Florge. In her final act beside him, petals radiant one last time, and then departed into the wild forever. Azette was left with the flower she had given him and the weight of 3,000 years, and the understanding that the relationship his weapon had been built to preserve was the relationship his weapon had ultimately destroyed. The AZ story has one further layer that connects it to the broader Pokemon world in ways that were never fully explained within the 6th generation games. Mega Evolution, the mechanic that defined the X and Y era, is canonically traced to the same energetic event. The ultimate weapon's detonation released energy that seeped into the Kalos Earth like invisible radiation, altering Pokemon at a cellular level and eventually crystallizing into the megastones that scattered across regions. When a trainer bonds with a Pokemon through a keystone and activates Mega Evolution, they are, unknowingly, drawing on the residual energy of the worst thing a grieving king ever built. Every Mega Evolution, every temporary transcendence to a more powerful form, carries within it the echo of that firing. The most spectacular mechanic of that generation is built on the foundation of a catastrophe no one alive fully remembers. And the golden flower that AZ still carried when he reappeared 3,000 years later in the postgame of Pokemon X and Y is the final key that could reignite the weapon if certain conditions were met. The past does not stay in the past in Kalos. It waits in the earth, charged and patient, for someone to be desperate enough to call it forward again. There is a question about the Pokemon world that arrives so quietly it is easy to miss entirely on a first encounter and impossible to shake once it has settled in. Where did the ordinary animals go? Not the Pokemon, who are extraordinary by definition, but the animals that the earliest entries in the franchise's Pokédex seem to assume exist alongside them. The birds that aren't Pidgey, the fish that aren't Magikarp or Goldeen, the insects that aren't cataloged in any Pokédex, the creatures that breathed and moved and died in the ecological niches that Pokemon now occupy entirely, not because those niches weren't already filled, but because something happened to the things that used to fill them. In the original Red and Blue games, Certain Pokédex entries use language that implies the existence of a broader natural world. Pidgey's entry describes it nesting alongside what the text implies are common sparrows and finches, ordinary birds that share the sky without elemental powers or battle capabilities. Caterpie's entry references forest arachnids, spiders that are not spineric or ariados or any other cataloged species, creatures that occupied the same leaf litter were Caterpie pupats. Beedrill's entries mention prey that isn't named or typed in any Pokédex, small insects the size and character of things you would find in an ordinary summer meadow, not the Pokémon-shaped versions of insects that the games have since standardized. These references are not consistent across the generations. They appear in the early entries, in the language of a franchise that had not yet fully decided how much of its world's ecological reality it was willing to acknowledge, and then they are gradually edited away. By the later generations, the Pokédex entries have been stripped clean of these implications. Pidgey nests alongside nothing unaccounted for. The forest floor contains only cataloged species. The suggestion of ordinary life, persisting alongside the extraordinary, has been removed with the same deliberateness that tends to accompany things that have been looked at too closely and found uncomfortable. The clearest and most openly stated instance of this vanishing is Farfetch'd. Its Pokédex entry in later versions describes it as completely extinct in certain regions, a statement so direct in its bleakness that it reads like an anomaly against the general brightness of Pokédex language. But trace backward to the original entry, and the situation is even more precise. Farfetch'd is described as rare and diminishing, a holdout, a survivor clutching a leek as a talisman against hunters who prized it as a delicacy. This is an entry about a species that has been hunted toward extinction by humans who valued it as not as a companion, but as food. In a franchise that almost never directly addresses the consumption of Pokémon by people, this entry stands out with uncomfortable clarity. What does it mean for the relationship between humans and Pokémon that ordinary ducks no longer swim in Carlos ponds or Johto streams, that the ordinary birds have been replaced entirely by Pidgey and its evolutionary line, that ordinary fish have been supplanted by species that can learn Hyper Beam? The most uncomfortable theory, the one the lore seems to support when its fragments are assembled carefully, is that Pokémon themselves are the explanation, that the expansion of Pokémon into every available ecological niche was not a gentle coexistence, but a displacement, an outcompeting so complete that the fauna that preceded them simply could not survive alongside creatures that could call lightning from clear skies and regrow limbs between battles. It was not quick, and it was not violent in any single dramatic moment. It was ecological, the slow kind of tragedy that happens when two things compete for the same space, and one of them has properties the other cannot match. The ordinary world retreated by increments, its birds replaced by fire birds, its fish replaced by water types, its mammals replaced by creatures whose metabolisms run on battle energy rather than anything as simple as prey. And the world moved on without noting the departure, and the Pokédex entries were gradually revised to remove the traces of what had been there before. What you are left with is a world that looks complete and balanced and internally consistent, but that carries within it, in the margins of its earliest documentation, the quiet evidence of an extinction so total it erased itself from the record. There are Pokémon in the franchise whose Pokédex entries, read carefully, describe behavior that the games themselves never make fully explicit. Gengar's entry suggests that it infiltrates households and waits for an opportunity to remove the warmth from those who sleep within. Banette's entry describes a discarded doll, animated by pure malice, searching indefinitely for the child who abandoned it. These entries carry weight, but they carry it at a safe distance, the way a story told by firelight carries its weight, present and acknowledged, but contained by the frame of the telling. Dryfloon does not carry its weight at a safe distance. The balloon Pokemon is presented visually as cheerful and small and unthreatening. Its round body and trailing strings, it's suggesting a lost party favor rather than anything dangerous. It appears near water at dusk. It hangs in the air with a gentle patience, and multiple Pokédex entries across multiple generations state plainly, without the hedging language that typically softens unsettling implications in franchise documentation, that it takes away children. The diamond entry says it takes them away. The pearl entry says it lures them away with its balloon shape. The platinum entry notes that children who grab its strings are pulled skyward and carried off to the land of the dead. This is not presented as a consequence of mistaken contact or an unfortunate behavioral quirk. The entries describe this as a purpose. Dreyfloon is described as a Pokemon formed from the spirits of those who have died, and it uses the appealing shape of something a child would naturally reach for to gather more of its own kind. It arrives at dusk specifically, when children are outdoors without supervision, and when the light makes small floating objects appear more magical than threatening. The entries describe it as patient. It waits for children to approach. It does not rush. It knows what it is, and it knows how it looks, and it uses the gap between those two things with the consistency of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The Pokemon world has never made this explicit in a way that would require the games to address it directly. No NPC references children who disappeared near water at dusk and were never found. No storyline engages with the question of what the land of the dead means, or where it is, or whether anyone has ever returned from it. Drifloon can be caught and trained like any other Pokemon, its entries' implications never becoming the subject of any in-game conversation. It is one of many creatures in the franchise whose documented behavior exists in a separate register from the game's narrative, visible to anyone who reads carefully, but never acknowledged by the world the game constructs around you. What the Drifloon entries do, when held alongside the rest of the franchise's darker documentation, is suggest that the Pokemon world contains systems that run continuously and that no one who lives within that world fully accounts for. The brass tower burns, and 3 Pokemon die, and Ho-Oh intervenes with its divine power, and the beasts are remade and sent roaming. That intervention is visible, and its results are dramatic and present in the world. But the dusk arrivals of a small balloon-shaped creature at the edges of water, and the children who may or may not have reached for its strings over the generations, and where those children went, and what they found there. That is a system no legendary Pokemon has been sent to intervene in. It operates quietly in the hour between ordinary afternoon and the dark, and the world goes on around it as though the margin notes in the Pokédex are not saying what they appear to say. The Sinnoh League tournament is the closest Ash Ketchum ever came, across years of competition, to finally standing on the highest podium. He arrived at the semifinals, having defeated opponents who would have been considered formidable by any standard measure of what it means to be a skilled trainer. His team was experienced and deeply bonded with him. His journey through the Sinnoh region had sharpened him in ways that were visible in how he approached each match, and in the semifinal round, he lost to a trainer named Tobias, and what happened in that match is one of the most quietly troubling events in the entire anime's history. Tobias had a full team of legendary Pokemon. Not a single legendary carried as a trophy, alongside a roster of trained companions, but a complete team of 6 slots, each filled by a creature that, within the logic the anime has consistently applied to legendary Pokemon, should not be obtainable through any ordinary process of training or partnership. Legendaries in the anime are singular beings. They are not creatures a trainer finds in the tall grass and raises through battle and care. They are forces of nature that choose their interactions with humans very carefully, and that do not, as a general rule, agree to enter Pokeballs and be carried around waiting for league battles. Tobias opened with Darkrai, the nightmare Pokémon, whose Pokédex entries describe it as an entity that causes involuntary sleep and is unable to help the nightmares it produces because its very presence triggers them. It defeated every member of Ash's team except Pikachu and Sceptile before being beaten by a combination of extraordinary effort and a move that Sceptile shouldn't, by any conventional accounting, have been able to land. Tobias then sent out Latios, a legendary normally associated with its bond to a specific place and a specific relationship with the humans of that place, and the battle ended there with Ash losing to an opponent whose roster violated every established rule of what Pokemon training is supposed to look like. Tobias then won the tournament and vanished. He is mentioned in subsequent conversations, praised by commentators, noted as the winner of the Sinnoh League. But he does not appear again. No explanation is offered for who he is, or where he came from, or how a person in the Pokemon world comes to travel with a complete team of legendary Pokemon. He enters the narrative, breaks it by the standards it had always applied to itself, and then steps back out through the same door, leaving behind only the result of having been there. What Tobias represents is never named in the anime, but the theories that accumulated around him in the years following his appearance point consistently toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. He is connected to something that operates outside the ordinary structures of the Pokemon world. Teams that possess and command legendary Pokemon with the casual ease he displayed have appeared in other parts of the franchise's lore, and they are never associated with the kind of patient partnership that ordinary training requires. The organizations that pursue legendaries do so with technology and resources that most trainers will never have access to, and the results of that pursuit are rarely the warm and reciprocal bond that Ash has with Pikachu. They tend to look more like Tobias at the Sinnoh League, controlled and functional and deeply unsettling in what they imply about how that control was achieved. The silence around Tobias is the franchise protecting something it cannot afford to fully examine, because a world where a trainer can acquire an entire team of legendary Pokemon through whatever process Tobias used is a world where the relationship between humans and legendary Pokemon is very different from how that relationship has always been presented. And if that relationship is different at the level Tobias implies, then many of the things the franchise has communicated about the nature of legendary Pokemon, about their singularity and their independence and their fundamental uncontainability, require a reassessment that the story is not prepared to make. There is a small and easily missed piece of story that sits in the Pokemon Gold and Silver games and in the Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes, tucked into the residential areas of a city that the player passes through without much lingering. It concerns missing children. The precise nature of what happened to them is never fully established. A mother asks you to find her daughter. An investigation of the surrounding area turns up evidence that points toward a hypno, and then the thread ends, not resolved and explained, but set aside in the way that the Pokemon world frequently sets aside the threads it has pulled most carefully. Hypno is a Pokemon whose Pokédex entries across multiple generations are among the most consistently troubling in the entire franchise. Its ability to induce sleep in any creature that meets its gaze is described not as a defense mechanism, but as a habit, something it does routinely and without particular need. The Crystal version entry notes that it carries a pendulum and that staring at the swinging object causes irresistible drowsiness, adding the detail that there are once-in-a-while cases where it hypnotizes people it shouldn't and carries them off. The Gold entry is more specific. It notes that there are times when it hypnotizes people while making rounds and carries the affected person away and that the person is never found again. Never found again. That is a precise and deliberate choice of language in a document that normally softens its implications with qualifiers. The gold entry does not say that the person is rarely found, or that finding them is difficult, or that the circumstances of their disappearance remain unclear. It says they are never found again. In a franchise produced primarily for children, that sentence sits in the Pokédex like a door left open in a room that should be locked. The connection between Hypno's documented behavior and the missing children's side quest in Gold and Silver is never made explicit in the text of those games. The Pokemon involved in the incident is identified only obliquely, and the resolution of the quest, which involves defeating or calming the responsible Pokemon and returning the children, is presented without any engagement with the disturbing implications of the encounter. The child comes back. The mother is relieved. The game moves on. But the Pokédex entry remains, stating its unqualified fact across multiple generations, and the gap between that statement and the cheerful resolution of the quest is a gap the franchise has never chosen to close. Drifloon, as discussed earlier, operates through a similar mechanism, using an appealing appearance to draw children toward an irreversible outcome. Hypno uses a different kind of appeal, not the visual delight of a balloon, but the involuntary biological response to a stimulus designed to override conscious resistance. Both creatures are presented within the franchise as obtainable and trainable, as companions who can form bonds with the player and participate in the gym challenge and the broader adventure. Their Pokédex entries exist in a separate register from their in-game function, describing a behavior that the game never requires the player to witness directly and never requires the world's inhabitants to fully acknowledge. The entries are the part of the Pokemon world that is allowed to be honest about things the game itself cannot show. Every player who reached Lavender Town in the original Red and Blue games experienced something that a carefully designed color palette and a specific musical composition produced with precise intentionality. The town is violet in a game full of greens and blues. The music that plays there is not the cheerful or adventurous compositions of the earlier routes, but something that has always been described by the people who encountered it as a child with a particular and difficult to name quality. Slow, dissonant in a subtle way, organized around a melody that suggests unresolved movement without offering the resolution. It is music designed to make a child feel that they have arrived somewhere that does not follow the same rules as everywhere else. Lavender Town is a town built around a tower full of the dead. The Pokemon Tower stands at its center, and its purpose, which the game states clearly and without apology, is to serve as a memorial site and burial ground for deceased Pokemon. The upper floors are haunted by ghost-type Pokemon who cannot be engaged with until the player obtains a specific item, the Sylph Scope, that allows the ghost to be seen clearly rather than as formless shapes. Before that item is obtained, the upper floors are inaccessible in the specific way that the game communicates impassable barriers, but the ghosts are visible as shapes, moving through the space, inhabiting it, present to the player's perception, but not to the player's interaction. It is not a coincidence that the one ghost who is specifically distinguished from the others, the ghost who blocks the staircase and whose full encounter triggers the revelation of the Marowak's story, is not a random spirit but a mother. Specifically, it is the ghost of the Marowak whose Cubone waits somewhere in those same halls. The game does not spell this connection out in complete sentences. It implies it through the encounter structure and through the subsequent presence of the Cubone in the tower's area, and the implication is enough. A mother who was killed could not leave. She guards the path to the upper floors, not out of malice, but out of what might be described as the insistence of unfinished grief. She cannot move on until she is acknowledged, and the process of acknowledgement requires the player to have the tool to see her clearly. What Lavender Town represents in the larger map of the Pokemon world's emotional landscape is the place where the world's pretensions about the relationship between training and death are most visibly strained. Pokemon faint in battles. The game uses that word deliberately, and the implication it carries is that fainting is recoverable, temporary, a state that Pokemon centers exist specifically to reverse. But Pokemon Tower exists because Pokemon also die, permanently, in ways that Pokemon centers cannot address because there is nothing to bring back. The tower is full of stones, etched with names, and the people of Lavender Town live alongside this reality with the particular kind of normalcy that develops when a community has no choice but to integrate the presence of irreversible loss into its daily life. Gary Oak's Raticate, the companion who appeared at his side on the SS An and was gone by the time he arrived in Lavender Town, is perhaps the most discussed specific individual in the tower's history that the game does not acknowledge directly. The encounter structure creates the circumstance for a dark reading. Ash battles Gary on the SS Anne. The battle is physically vigorous in the game's implied combat terms, and when Gary next appears, he is standing in the town built to hold the permanently dead, and his Raticate is not with him. The game does not confirm the connection. It does not need to. The arrangement of events does the work, and the player's imagination, arriving in Lavender Town and feeling the specific weight of its music and its violet houses, fills the rest of the space with what it has been given to fill it with. Lieutenant Surge is a gym leader who survived a war. This is a fact the game states clearly through his own dialogue in Vermilion City, and it is one of the few moments in the entire franchise where the existence of large-scale human conflict is confirmed rather than implied. He is abrasive in a way that has calculation behind it, the kind of social manner that forms when someone has decided that being pleasant is a risk they can no longer afford. His Pokémon are electric types that he describes as having saved his life in battle, and the word battle here is not a gym challenge metaphor. He means combat. He means the kind of situation where the question of survival was genuinely open. The war itself is never named or dated or given a geography in the main series games. It exists in the space between sentences, in the particular weight that Lieutenant Surge carries, and in the ruins and the military structures that appear across Kanto and Johto and the other regions without explanation. We could say there are fortifications that serve no obvious contemporary purpose. There are routes that have the layout of former supply lines. There are towers that were built to honor the dead in ways that would only be necessary if the dead had accumulated in numbers that required institutional acknowledgement. The architecture of a world that went through something terrible and then rebuilt around it without dismantling the monuments to the event is everywhere in the Pokemon regions, if you look for it. For certain species hint at it obliquely. Describing battle capabilities in language that goes beyond gym competition into something heavier and more final. The way certain Pokemon's bodies are described as built for combat in terms that do not quite fit a world where combat means a structured exchange of movesets and feinting. The way certain items in the game world are described as military surplus or repurposed ordnance. The way the landscape itself still carries the shape of something that happened and was not fully recovered from. What the war's absence from explicit discussion produces is a particular kind of unease that is different from the unease generated by supernatural mysteries, like the Ghost Girl or the Burned Tower. Those mysteries are unsettling because they contain something that cannot be explained within ordinary categories. The war mystery is unsettling because it is entirely ordinary in its category, entirely recognizable as the kind of thing that has always happened in the world, in its absence from acknowledgement in a franchise built around themes of friendship and growth and the ethical relationship between humans and other living things is a specific and significant choice. The Pokemon world had a war. Pokemon were used in it as weapons. The franchise does not want to look at this directly, and the not looking is more disturbing in its way than any ghost or any tower or any small balloon Pokemon drifting at dusk above the water. Across all these mysteries, a pattern begins to emerge that is worth naming before the evening settles fully into rest. The Pokemon world is a world that has built its visible surface carefully and with great skill. The routes are colorful, and the music is warm, and the relationships between trainers and their Pokemon are presented with a genuine emotional intelligence that has resonated with millions of people across 30 years. None of this is false. The warmth is real, the friendships are real, the growth is real. But underneath all of that, built into the foundation that the bright surface rests upon, is a layer of loss and grief and unresolved violence that the world has never found a way to fully address. Every gym exists in the architectural aftermath of something darker. Every legend was preceded by a catastrophe. Every immortal creature is carrying a wound that immortality has made impossible to heal. The Pokemon world is not secretly a dark place pretending to be bright. It is a bright place built on the ruins of something darker, and the ruins are still there, under the roots and the cities and the music, waiting to be found by anyone who looks carefully enough. That is perhaps the most honest and most quietly disturbing thing about all of this. Not that the darkness exists, but that it is necessary. The brightness of the world, the warmth of the friendships, the genuine beauty of the trainer's journeys, all of it is more meaningful because of what it was built on top of. The Pokemon world knows grief, it knows loss, it knows war and extinction, and the specific horror of creatures made immortal by the worst thing they ever did. And it keeps going. It keeps building roots and gems and relationships. It keeps producing new generations of trainers who set out at 10 years old into a world that is carrying all of this weight invisibly and who nevertheless find, in that world, the things worth finding. The ghost girl is still searching for the one. Cubone is still weeping in a cave somewhere in the dark. The three legendary beasts are still roaming Johto's paths, still racing and purifying and hungering for the warmth of a world that the fire took from them. Azitz is still walking, 3,000 years later, carrying a flower and a weapon's legacy in the same pair of hands. The ordinary animals are gone from the meadows they once inhabited, and somewhere in Lumio's city, above the bright lights, the elevator opens to an empty floor that is not quite empty. The mysteries don't resolve. They settle into the architecture of the world, and they stay there, present and unanswered, shaping everything that rests above them. And the world keeps going, which is perhaps the most honest thing any world has ever done with the weight it is carrying. It does not resolve its grief. It does not explain its ghosts. It keeps building new roots across the old ruins. It keeps sending children into the tall grass at the edge of town. It keeps believing, in the face of everything, that something worth finding is out there. On Cinnabar Island, behind the glass cases of a laboratory that the player enters through a broken window and explores without encountering any living staff, there is a journal. It is written in the clipped, dispassionate language of scientific documentation, and it records with minimal emotional register an event that is among the most disturbing in the entire franchise's lore. A living creature was created in that laboratory, assembled from the genetic material of the rarest and most powerful Pokémon ever documented, and then subjected to years of experimentation, modification, and confinement that transformed whatever it might have become into something that emerged from that facility with a fully formed and entirely comprehensible desire for the destruction of the species responsible for what was done to it. Mewtwo's origin is one of the few cases in the franchise where the horror of what occurred is narrated directly in the player character's own accessible text, without the softening distance of implication or the plausible deniability of mythology. The journal entries describe the genetic reconstruction of Mew's DNA. They describe the growing of a new life form in conditions of clinical isolation. They describe the researchers watching as their creation developed and their growing awareness, recorded in entries that become shorter and more clipped as the account progresses, that what they were making was not the powerful biological tool they had intended, but something that was becoming more aware and more angry by increments they had not anticipated and could not control. The final entries record destruction. The facility is abandoned. The island keeps the secret of what was built and set loose there, preserved in the broken glass and the equipment and the journal that the player finds when they climb through the window. What makes this particularly significant in the context of the franchise's unresolved mysteries is that the Cinnabar Laboratory represents an explicit and acknowledged case of something the world has generally preferred to address only through implication: the use of Pokémon as subjects of experimentation that does not serve their well being, the creation of living creatures for purposes that had nothing to do with the creatures themselves, the transformation of something with the capacity for awareness and suffering into a weapon, not through the kind of military deployment the war mystery hints at, but through the more intimate and therefore more troubling process of constructing something from nothing and then subjecting it to conditions that shaped it before it could choose what shape to take. Mewtwo left Cinnabar Island. The games do not follow its movements with any detail, but the first film, Mewtwo Strikes Back, engages with the aftermath of that departure. The film's Mewtwo is fully aware of its own origin and of the deliberate choices that produce the conditions of that origin. It is not confused about what was done to it or why. It is angry with a clarity and a precision that is entirely appropriate to the information it has. The question the film engages with, imperfectly and somewhat sentimentally, but not dishonestly, is whether a creature created under those conditions and holding that knowledge and that anger can find a reason to continue existing that is not organized entirely around the destruction of the species that created it. The Pokédex entries for Mewtwo across the franchise's history document a creature that is described as the most powerful of all Pokémon, as having a ferocity unmatched by any other, and as possessing a heart softened in recent accounts by some experience or encounter that the entries decline to specify. What softened it is not narrated in any game. The shift between the creature who emerged from Cinnabar Laboratory and the creature who appears in the postgame of certain titles, quiet and isolated, and apparently at peace with its existence, in a way the journal entries would not have predicted, represents one of the franchise's most significant unresolved narrative questions. Something happened to Mewtwo that changed the orientation of its existence. The franchise has gestured at what that something might be and then declined consistently to state it plainly. The Cinnabar Laboratory is not the only place in the Pokemon world where this kind of experimentation took place, and the unease that attaches to its specific history is amplified rather than contained by the existence of other facilities with similar qualities. The power plants of Kanto and Kalos both contain evidence of work that was being done with Pokémon in circumstances that the games depict as sealed off and inaccessible. The Sinnoh Underground's oldest chambers hold documentation of experiments conducted by organizations that treated Pokémon as materials rather than beings. The pattern of sealed rooms and abandoned documentation and locked corridors appears in every region with sufficient consistency to suggest that the Pokemon world has a systematic and long-standing practice of this kind of work that its public-facing institutions have collectively agreed not to discuss. What the existence of Mewtwo establishes, and what the Cinnabar Laboratory Journal makes explicit in a way that nothing else in the franchise quite matches, is that the world the player inherits when they step out of their bedroom in Pallet Town is built on decisions that were made before the player arrived and that are still producing consequences. Mewtwo is out there. Whatever it became after the events of the first film is out there. The Cinnabar Laboratory still stands, or stood, until the volcano erupted and Cinnabar Island sank beneath the sea in the events between the first and second generations. An eruption that the franchise never explains, occurring specifically on the island where the franchise's most ethically significant act of creation took place. The geography of consequence in the Pokemon world is, if you trace it carefully, not random at all. In the depths of Terminus Cave, at the edge of the Kalos region, something waits. It is not waiting in the way that a legendary Pokemon waits in its shrine or its mountain for a trainer worthy of encountering it. It is waiting in a more fundamental sense, in the sense of a function preparing to execute if certain conditions are met. Zygarde, the order Pokemon, is described across its various entries and appearances as the guardian of Kalos's ecosystem, the entity responsible for maintaining balance in the natural world. But its most significant characteristic, the one that the 6th generation games deliberately withheld and the 7th generation eventually revealed, is that what trainers encounter in Terminus Cave is not Zygarde. What trainers encounter there is a partial form. Zygarde's cells, microscopic organisms that distribute themselves throughout the ecological systems of the world, gather and coalesce into the serpentine dragon form that appears in the game, but this form represents only 50% of Zygarde's complete collection. When all of its cells are assembled, which the 7th generation's Zygarde arc in the anime and the Sun and Moon games establish, is a capability the Pokemon possesses in response to specific environmental threats. The resulting entity is something that the 6th generation games deliberately cut before showing. The Kalos games were designed with a continuation in mind that did not arrive. The power plant on Route 10 has sealed rooms that data mining has revealed were intended to contain material connected to Zygarde's full awakening and its role as a response to forces like the destructive applications of Mega Evolution and the threat of Lysandra's ultimate weapon. Those story elements were stripped from the released game and never restored. The creature that was meant to emerge from Terminus Cave as the region's ultimate defender, its complete form unfurling in response to the accumulated damage the region had suffered, remained dormant in the files as the franchise moved forward without looking back at what it had left unfinished in Kalos. Zygarde's cells are everywhere. That is the most quietly strange aspect of its design. They move through the world as invisible distributed fragments, observing the ecosystems they are embedded within, measuring the state of the balance they exist to protect. The lore suggests that the number of cells assembled into a given Zygarde form is proportional to the severity of the threat being responded to. A 50% form means a significant but not catastrophic disruption. 100% form means something is happening that the ordinary world cannot address through ordinary means. And the fact that the player encounters a 50% form in Terminus Cave at the end of the 6th generation story suggests that the Kalos region, in the aftermath of Lysandra's weapon and the events of the game's climax, exists in a state that Zygarde has already assessed as requiring intervention at half its capacity. What would trigger the full form has never been shown in the games. The anime approached it gently and without committing to the full implications of what 100% Zygarde would mean for the world around it. But the games have left the Terminus Cave form exactly as it is, 50% assembled, watching the region from underground, and the silence around what it is watching for is the silence of a story that was begun and deliberately set aside before its most significant development could arrive. The creation mythology of the Unova region, which the 5th generation games approach with a seriousness and a philosophical depth unusual for the franchise, offers one of the clearest windows into the Pokemon world's relationship with the unresolvable. In the ancient highlands of what would become Unova, the original dragon that Reshiram and Zekrom descended from was not divided by conflict between strangers or broken by external force. It was divided from within by the irreconcilable disagreement of the two people who loved it most, the two brothers who had raised it, and whose bond with each other had been the energy that allowed it to become what it was. The original dragon's body could not survive the fracture of that bond because the bond was, in some fundamental sense, what the dragon was made of. Not metaphorically, but literally, in the way that the Pokemon world sometimes means things literally that other mythologies would treat as metaphor. The dragon's power was the power of two perspectives held together. When the perspectives separated, the body that housed them could not remain whole. It divided into the aspects that had always been present within it, and what remained after the division was Kyurem, the hollow shell, which is not the emptiness left behind, but something stranger and more specific than that. Kyurem is the possibility of completion. Its body is designed for wholeness in a way that it cannot achieve alone, because what it needs in order to be whole is not simply the return of the other two, but the reconciliation of the relationship that their division destroyed. It can be forcibly merged with Reshiram or Zekrom through the DNA splicers, a process the fifth generation games make available to the player, and that the seventh chapter of the game's story engages with through Ghetsis' attempt to use this fusion as a weapon. But the resulting black Kyurem, or white Kyurem, is not the original dragon restored. It is an incomplete creature forced into a larger shape, which is a different and more troubling thing than wholeness. The quest that would actually restore the original dragon is not available in any game. The circumstances that would produce it, the genuine reconciliation of the truth and ideal orientations rather than their forced merger, have not been depicted in any mainline title. The dragon that was shattered by a philosophical disagreement between brothers 3,000 years before the events of Black and White remains shattered. Kyurem remains in the giant chasm, a vast and frozen place that functions as a kind of monument to the specific temperature of this particular incompleteness. Cold, vast, containing within it the space where something should be but isn't. The Pokemon world carries this wound because the wound cannot be healed through any of the means the world currently has available to it. Truth and ideals are not reconciled by champions. They are reconciled, if they are reconciled at all, by the much longer and less dramatic process of understanding that both perspectives are necessary and that the relationship between them is more important than the supremacy of either. No game has yet depicted what that reconciliation would look like. The hollow chest of Kyurem continues to hold the cold of everything that was lost. There is a thread running through all of these mysteries that is worth naming clearly before the evening draws to its close. Every one of the unresolved stories in the Pokemon world centers on a relationship that was broken and has not been repaired. The bond between Ash and his absent father. The bond between Cubone and the mother whose skull it carries. The bond between the three legendary beasts and the ordinary lives they were before the fire. The bond between AZ and his Flabébé, stretched across 3,000 years and a weapon's worth of grief. The bond between the two brothers and the dragon that was made of their relationship. The ghost girl and whoever it is that she has been searching for through the elevator shafts of a glittering city and the windswept graves of another region. The Pokemon world's darkness is not the darkness of malice or the darkness of randomness. It is the darkness of interrupted connection, of relationships severed before they could arrive at their natural conclusion, of bonds that were strong enough to shape the world and were broken in ways that the world has not found a way to set right. The three legendary beasts run because running is all that remains of the lives that were interrupted. Kyurem is hollow because the relationship that filled it no longer exists in the form that could fill it again. A Z walks because there is nowhere to go when the only destination you had was a relationship you destroyed in the act of trying to preserve it. The Pokemon world understands something about grief that it does not say directly, but that every one of these mysteries encodes. Grief is not the absence of the thing that was lost, it is the persistence of the bond after the thing it connected to is gone. Cubone does not grieve because its mother is absent. It grieves because the bond is still there, intact and fully functioning, extending into a space that no longer has anything to receive it. The legendary beasts do not run in search of peace. They run because the bond between what they were and what they became has no resolution available to it, and running is what the bond does when it cannot find what it is reaching for. This is the most honest and most quietly devastating thing that the Pokemon world's darkest corners contain. Not violence, not extinction, not the deliberate cruelty of experiments conducted in sealed laboratories, but the persistence of care beyond the circumstances that originally justified it. The stubbornness of connection, the way that love, in all the forms it takes in this world, refuses to simply stop when the conditions that originally produced it have changed. It continues, it searches, it wears the skull, it glides through the elevator, it races the storm, it carries the flower, it waits in the frozen cave for a wholeness that may never come, and the Pokemon world, which could have resolved these stories at any point, which has had 3 decades and dozens of titles in which to close these doors and settle these ghosts, has chosen not to. The mysteries persist because the bonds persist. Because somewhere in the decisions being made about what this world is and what it says, there is an understanding that some things are true and that their truth requires them to remain unresolved. The Ghost Girl is still searching because whoever she seeks is still genuinely lost. Kyurem is still hollow because the original dragon has not been restored. A Z is still walking because 3,000 years is not long enough to process what he did and what it cost him. These are not failures of storytelling. They are, in their way, its most honest achievements. The acknowledgement that some things in the world do not resolve. They are carried. And the carrying is what we are left with when we finally stop asking for an ending. Another quiet detail becomes clear when you consider the particular kind of courage it takes to build these unanswered questions into a world designed for young people. The franchise understood from very early in its history that the questions that haunt us most persistently are not the questions with wrong answers, but the questions with no answers at all. Children who played the original Red and Blue games and felt something heavy and particular in the music of Lavender Town grew into adults who still carry that quality of feeling, who can identify it immediately when they encounter it in other contexts, who have a name for it now that they lacked at 10 years old. That weight was real. The designers put it there intentionally, and it was the right thing to put there, not because children need to be burdened, but because children, like everyone, benefit from a world that acknowledges its own weight, honestly, rather than pretending that all the difficult questions have been quietly resolved somewhere out of sight. On a windswept route near the northern edge of Sinnoh's most frozen territory, tucked against the tree line, where the snow has drifted so high that it swallows the lower windows entirely, there stands a structure that the map labels simply as the Strange House. The name is accurate and insufficient at the same time. Strange does not fully account for what waits inside, for the particular quality of the silence that fills its rooms, or for the 2 spirits that still move through its hallways, as though the event that ended their daughter's life has not yet fully resolved into something they can understand and file away as past. The Father's Spirit speaks, when it speaks at all, in the measured and fractured way of someone recounting a disaster in which they were both participant and witness. He describes his daughter's illness, without ever using the word illness, because what happened to her was not an illness in any ordinary sense. She began to decline. Her sleep became troubled. The troubles deepened over days into something that required a name, and the name the lore provides is Darkrai's curse, though the father never quite says this directly. He speaks around it in the way that people speak around the center of something they cannot look at straight. Darkrai is the nightmare Pokémon, the legendary of New Moon Island, a creature the Pokédex entries describe across multiple generations with a consistency that borders on clinical. It causes nightmares. It does this without intent, in the same way a very cold surface causes frost. It is not malicious. It is constitutionally what it is, and what it is causes suffering to anything with a sleeping mind that comes within its influence. The child in the strange house came within that influence. Perhaps she wandered too close to the place where Darkrai's presence overlapped with the ordinary world. Perhaps there was no clear reason at all, which is in some ways the most disturbing possibility, because it would mean that the nightmare simply found her the way that weather finds a coastline, without selection, without meaning, without any of the explanatory architecture that would make the loss easier to carry. Her parents did what parents do when ordinary remedies fail. They went in search of the extraordinary one, the lunar wing, a feather shed by Cresselia, the crescent Pokemon, and Darkrai's counterpart in the cosmic balance the Sinnoh mythology describes, is the one substance in the lore that can interrupt a Darkrai-induced nightmare state. Cresselia and Darkrai exist in a relationship the games frame as opposition, but that might more accurately be described as completion. Darkness and light, the nightmare and the dream. They circle each other across the geography of Sinnoh, and the folklore of the region has always understood that one cannot exist without implying the other's presence somewhere just out of sight. The parents made the journey to Full Moon Island, which the games describe as difficult, and the lore implies was considerably more than that. Full Moon Island in the games is a serene and slightly otherworldly place, the kind of location that feels removed from the urgency of the main world, and reaching it requires crossing open water and navigating circumstances that the game's frame is involving more than ordinary logistical difficulty. They reached it. They obtained the feather. They turned back toward home carrying in their hands the one thing that could have saved what they had crossed every obstacle to return to. They arrived too late. The daughter was gone. The nightmare had already completed its work in their absence, and what they came back to was a house rather than a home, rooms that still contained her things, a bed that still held the shape of her, and a silence that the Pokemon world has never since seen fit to break with any resolution or explanation. The spirits of both parents still move through those rooms. The father speaks, the mother does not. Her apparition glides through the upper floor in a pale dress, pausing near the window that looks out toward the direction they had traveled, and she murmurs something that the game's text box renders as barely audible, as though even her lingering presence cannot fully commit to being witnessed. What the strange house contains, beyond the tragedy of what happened there, is a portrait of the specific grief that comes from being almost in time. Not too late by years or generations, the way some of the Pokemon world's older losses are measured. Too late by hours, too late by the margin that would have mattered. The lunar wing is still there in the house, perhaps, or perhaps not. The details shift between versions of the game, but the implication holds regardless. The thing that would have worked arrived after the window, for it had closed, and the house has been carrying that knowledge ever since, holding it in the way that a place holds the emotional register of what occurred within it, not in any supernatural sense, but simply in the way that certain rooms feel permanently weighted by what they have witnessed. This is one of the most quietly devastating things that the Pokemon world has ever placed in front of a player without commentary or resolution. The strange house exists on the map. You can walk past it, you can enter it, you can read the father's text and observe the mother's apparition and leave again, and the game will not ask you to feel anything specific about what you saw there. It simply shows you the room and trusts that the weight of it will settle without needing to be named. That restraint, the willingness to present something this specific and this sorrowful without wrapping it in explanation, is one of the most remarkable qualities the franchise has. The strange house is never brought up again in any subsequent game. The parents still search. The daughter is still gone. The world moved on without resolving it, because some things do not resolve. The mythology of Darkrai and Cresselia in Sinnoh is older than either of them. It predates their appearances in the games, predates the game systems in which they were conceived, rooting itself in something fundamental about the way the human mind has always organized experience into the categories of dream and nightmare, safety and threat, the moon that protects and the moon that hides. Cresselia's crescent form moves through the night sky of the game world in a way that feels genuinely lunar, as though she is not inhabiting a location but a phase, appearing and disappearing as the conditions of the world shift. Darkrai occupies New Moon Island, the island that exists in the complete absence of light, the place where even the sky provides nothing to see by. What the mythology suggests, and what the game never fully articulates, is that these two entities are not enemies in any meaningful sense. They are functions. Darkrai does not choose to cause nightmares any more than a winter storm chooses to cause cold. Cresselia does not choose to dispel them out of compassion, though the way she is designed encourages that reading. They are complements, aspects of the same system, and the fact that Darkrai's unmediated presence causes suffering says nothing about its intentions, because it has no intentions in the way the word is usually meant. It is what it is, and what it is passes through a sleeping world like a weather pattern, leaving disruption in its wake that no amount of compassion on Cresselia's part can wholly prevent, because the disruption is not caused by the absence of compassion, but by the nature of what Darkrai is. The child in the strange house is the face the mythology puts on this abstraction. The cosmic balance between dream and nightmare is an interesting idea until it has a bedroom and a window and a pale dress drifting past it in silence. Then it becomes something else. Then it becomes the specific weight of a specific loss, and the mythology does not comfort that weight. It simply holds it, the way the strange house itself holds it, without resolution, without the offer of a different ending, with only the understanding that the events that occurred were real within the terms of the world they occurred in, and that the world has chosen to remember them precisely because it has no better answer to offer. Every Friday, at 4 in the afternoon, a small purple shape appears near the Valley Windworks, on the western edge of Sinnoh's flower-covered plains. It bobs on the updrafts that rise from the windmill turbines, its round body and trailing yellow hands moving with the particular lightness of something that is not quite weight-bearing in the way that physical objects normally are. It looks like a balloon. It is drawn toward children in the same way that something edible is drawn toward hunger, which is to say, it is not drawn toward them at all in any agentive sense. It simply appears where children are most likely to be, in the way that a predator's pattern of movement eventually maps itself onto the pattern of its prey's movement, and the convergence is regular enough to have become folklore. The Pokédex entries for Drifloon are among the most consistently disturbing in the entire franchise, and the franchise has a great many disturbing entries. What distinguishes Drifloon's entries from the others is not their violence or their darkness, but their specificity. They name the mechanism, and they name the victim, and they offer no mitigation. In the words of one generation's entry, a child who mistook it for a balloon and held on would be carried to the afterlife. Not might be, not could be in extreme circumstances, would be. The implication is that this has occurred, that the mechanism is not theoretical, and that the world Drifloon inhabits has simply absorbed this fact about it, the way that the world absorbs any environmental hazard, with local knowledge and seasonal warnings, and the quiet practice of keeping children indoors on Friday afternoons near windmill fields. Driftblim, its evolved form, amplifies this without softening it. Driftblim is large enough to carry multiple passengers, and the game's entries note that it carries them high into the clouds and then drops them, which would be the full completion of what Drifloon begins when a child's hand closes around what they believe to be a toy. The entries across generations use words like lure and carry and fairy, which are the words of intentionality, though whether Drifloon and Driftblim possess intentionality in any meaningful sense is one of the questions the lore does not resolve. The entries use these words because the behavior they describe is consistent and directed. Whether that consistency reflects purpose or simply the operation of instinct is left, as so many things in the Pokemon world's darker corners are left without answer. The Valley Windworks itself contributes to the strangeness. It is a large industrial building in a part of Sinnoh that otherwise feels pastoral and open, a steel structure surrounded by tall grass and connected to a river that runs through farmland. Team Galactic uses it in the main narrative of the games as a staging point, locking the workers inside. But before and after that narrative, the Windworks simply exists as what it is, a power-generating facility on a pleasant route where Drifloon appears every Friday at 4 o'clock and where the game provides no explanation for either the regularity of the appearance or the specific hour or the specific day. Theories have accumulated around this regularity, the way theories accumulate around any recurring strangeness that the game itself declines to explain. Some suggest that the electromagnetic activity of the turbines generates conditions favorable to ghost-type manifestation, that the spinning blades stir something in the air that makes the veil between ordinary space and whatever space Drifloon occupies thinner on the day and hour of strongest wind. Others point to the proximity of the building to older routes and older structures, suggesting that the Windworks occupies ground that carried significance before the industrial building arrived. None of these theories have any official support. They exist in the space that the game created by being specific without being explanatory, by establishing that the appearance is regular without establishing why. What the Drifloon mystery carries, held against the Hypno side quest in the Savii Islands, and the Darkrai story in the Strange House, and the Pokédex entries for other ghost-type Pokémon like Phantump, whose entries note that they are the transformed spirits of children who became lost in forests and died, is the suggestion of a pattern. The Pokemon world has, distributed through its various regions, and encoded in the entries and side quests and background details that most players pass through without pausing to examine, a consistent and apparently deliberate documentation of things that happen to children who encounter certain Pokemon. These things are not presented as tragedies within the main narrative. They are presented as background facts, environmental conditions, the natural characteristics of creatures that exist in the world alongside people and that have properties which in specific circumstances produce outcomes that the main game does not dwell on. The restraint is notable. The franchise could have done almost anything with these details. It could have built narratives around them, constructed quest lines in which players track down missing children and confront the Pokemon responsible and receive some form of resolution. It has occasionally done versions of this, the Hypno side quest in Fire Red and Leaf Green being the clearest example, but mostly it has simply noted these things and moved on, letting them accumulate in the margins of the world without ever bringing them to the center. The center of the Pokemon world is always the player's journey, always the gym badges and the rivalries and the legendary encounters, and what lives in the margins lives there permanently, noted and unaddressed, which is perhaps the most honest thing the franchise has ever done with the darkness it has always known its world contains. There is a man who runs an organization. His name is Giovanni, and for the first two generations of Pokemon games, he functions as both the final gym leader of Kanto and the criminal mastermind at the head of Team Rocket, a dual identity that the games present without quite acknowledging the philosophical weight of what it implies. The gym leader system, the infrastructure of regulated Pokemon battles that forms the institutional backbone of the player's journey, is partially administered by a man who uses that same infrastructure as cover for an organization built on exploitation, theft, and the extraction of resources from Pokemon treated as commodities rather than beings. The Gym Challenge and Team Rocket are not separate things connected by a person. They are the same operation wearing different faces. Giovanni is defeated at the end of both narrative threads that converge on him. The player beats his gym team and earns the Earth Badge. The player dismantles Team Rocket's Viridian hideout, confronts him as the team's leader, defeats him there too, and watches him walk away from the defeated organization with a composure that suggests he is not particularly surprised by what has occurred and is simply calculating what comes next. He leaves. He does not flee dramatically. He simply goes, and the second generation establishes in a radio broadcast that Team Rocket has subsequently dissolved, its members waiting in Goldenrod City for a signal from a leader who has not returned. Giovanni's fate after this moment is one of the most persistent, unresolved questions in the franchise's main game lore. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes of the second generation, add material that the original Gold and Silver did not contain. They give Giovanni a scene in which he encounters his son Silver, who has grown up with a violent bitterness toward his father and a drive toward competitive mastery that reads throughout the game as an attempt to become something his father cannot dismiss. Giovanni stands before him and says very little. The scene carries an enormous amount of emotional weight for the small number of lines it contains. A father who chose an organization over a family. A son who chose cruelty as a substitute for a tenderness he was never given the tools to express. They look at each other on a cliff edge at the end of the game, and neither of them has the language for what is between them. This scene did not exist in the original games. It was added decades later, retroactively, a small act of humanizing a villain who the original games had presented as a final boss, and then simply let walk away from the story. The willingness to return to Giovanni and give him this moment, to place him in front of the son he left behind, and let the silence between them carry the weight of everything that was never said, is one of the most careful things the franchise has done with a character who could easily have remained simply a recurring obstacle. But Giovanni's location, after the events of the radio broadcast, is never confirmed. The Sev-I Islands arc of Fire Red and Leaf Green shows Team Rocket still operating under his direction, which takes place chronologically before the collapse, suggesting he was still active for some period following his Viridian City defeat. What happens after the organization's dissolution, after he stops answering the radio signals and the Goldenrod grunts disperse, has never been shown in any mainline game. He exists in the lore as a man who walked away from two separate finalities, neither of which produced a conclusion, and who may still be walking. The franchise has not confirmed his death. It has not confirmed any destination. It has simply left him in the space between the scene at the cliff with Silver and the silence that comes after the radio goes quiet, and that space is, as so many of the Pokemon world's most unresolved spaces are, both very small and impossible to fully contain. The Pokemon world has a particular relationship with its villains that distinguishes it from most other franchises. They do not tend to be defeated and destroyed. They are defeated so and allowed to continue, to walk into whatever comes next, to face the consequences of what they have done in private, off screen, in spaces the narrative declines to show. Giovanni walks away. Lysandra walks into what appears to be a catastrophic weapon detonation, and the games leave that outcome ambiguous enough that his fate, too, is something the lore has never officially closed. Getsus is defeated in 2 generations, and both defeats leave him alive, diminished, and somewhere in the world. The Pokemon world does not generally offer its villains the conclusive ending of death. It offers them the inconclusive outcome of having to continue living with themselves, which is in its own way a darker and more honest sentence. Silver, Giovanni's son, carries the weight of his father's choices in the way that children carry the choices they did not make and were not consulted about, which is to say, completely and without obvious mechanism. His story in the 2nd-generation games is presented primarily through battle and dialogue, the compressed vocabulary of a game in which character development has to do its work in small spaces. He is aggressive. He is dismissive of weaker trainers and of Pokemon he deems insufficiently useful. He takes Totodile from Professor Elm's lab by force rather than asking, and this act of theft at the beginning of his story is meant to establish him as an antagonist in the mold of his father, a person who takes what he wants because he has concluded that the alternative, asking and potentially being refused, is not a pattern worth learning. By the end of the game, he has shifted, not dramatically, not with the kind of explicit redemption arc that would have required more space to develop than the game allocates. But something in him has moved. He acknowledges that his Pokémon are not tools. He thanks the player after their final battle, which is the first time in the game that he has expressed anything resembling gratitude toward anyone. It is a small moment, easy to miss, and the game does not dwell on it, but it is there, and what it says is that the boy who grew up with Giovanni for a father has, through the specific experience of repeated defeat by a trainer who fights with genuine care for the creatures in their team, arrived at a position where care is at least conceivable to him as a framework. This is not resolution. This is the first inch of distance from a starting point that was very far from where he needs to eventually be. The franchise has always understood that an inch of genuine movement is worth noting even when resolution is nowhere in sight. In the creation mythology of the Sinnoh region, which the 4th-generation games distribute across multiple locations in fragments that accumulate slowly as the player travels deeper into the narrative, there is a detail that most players encounter and move past without pausing to examine its full weight. Arceus, the first Pokémon, the entity from which the Sinnoh mythology says all other things descended, created the world. It created Dialga, who governs time. It created Palkia, who governs space. It created Giratina, who governs antimatter, the negative matter that the physical universe requires as its foundation, but that exists in a state of permanent inversion relative to the ordinary world. And then it sent Giratina away, not because Giratina had failed, not because it had been defeated or demonstrated an incapacity to function as what it was created to be. The Sinnoh mythology, as far as the games allow it to be read, suggests that Giratina was banished for violence, for having demonstrated a destructive quality that made its presence in the ordinary world incompatible with the stability of everything else Arceus had made. It was exiled to the distortion world, the inverted space that functions as the structural support for the physical universe, the place that must exist for the ordinary world to be stable, but that cannot itself be visited or inhabited without fundamentally disrupting what the visitor has come from. The distortion world in Platinum is one of the most genuinely strange environments in the history of the franchise. Its design is a consistent inversion of the physical world's logic. Waterfalls flow upward. Platforms float in defiance of any gravitational reference point. The perspective shifts in ways that make it impossible to establish a stable orientation. It is beautiful and deeply disorienting, and what it communicates through its visual language alone, before any Pokédex entry is consulted or any mythological detail is assembled, is that the ordinary rules that make experience navigable do not apply here. The distortion world is what the world looks like from the outside, which is also to say, it is what the world looks like if you are something that was created to exist at the boundary rather than within the center. Giratina moves through this space with the ease of a creature for whom this inversion is simply home. Its body is designed for it, the serpentine wings of its origin form spreading through the inverted space, the way that wings are shaped for the specific atmosphere they evolved in. In the distortion world, Giratina is not an exile. It is exactly where it belongs, in the space it was made to inhabit, doing the work that its creation required of it. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is not that it was sent somewhere unsuitable. The tragedy is the reason it was sent, the violence that Arceus judged sufficient to separate it from the world it had also been made for, the ordinary space where Dialga and Palkia move freely, and where the creations of the living world go about the business of living, without knowing that the structure beneath them is maintained by something they cannot see. Giratina watches the ordinary world from the distortion world in the way that something watches from beneath a surface it cannot cross. The fourth generation games, and particularly the Platinum version that restores the Giratina story to the prominence it deserves, suggests that this watching is not passive. Giratina intervenes when Cyrus's actions threaten the boundary between the two worlds, when the Spear Pillar events create a disruption severe enough that the distortion world itself begins to break down. It acts, not out of anything the games attribute to compassion or protectiveness toward the ordinary world, but because the ordinary world and the distortion world are not separable, because what threatens one threatens the structure that makes both possible. What the Giratina mythology asks, and what the games never quite answer, is whether the banishment was just, whether what Arceus judged as violence requiring exile was something that Giratina understood as violence, or something it understood as simply being what it was, acting in accordance with its antimatter nature in a physical world whose stability required a restraint that its nature made impossible. The mythology does not exonerate Giratina, but it does not clearly condemn it either. It presents the banishment as a fact and leaves the question of its justice in the space between the facts, which is where all of the Pokémon world's most genuinely difficult questions live. The distortion world exists beneath every route and every city and every ordinary space in the Sinnoh games, which is to say, it exists beneath every step the player takes without the player ever knowing it is there. This is the most honest thing the Giratina story says about the structure of the world. The foundation is not accessible from within the thing it supports. The maintenance is invisible from the perspective of what is maintained. Giratina holds the world from beneath it in a space no map acknowledges, doing the work that Arceus created it to do, and the ordinary world continues in complete ignorance of that support, which is perhaps not so different from the way that any structure depends on its foundation without ever having occasion to think about what that foundation contains. The Sinnoh creation mythology builds toward Arceus in a way that is architecturally impressive and philosophically incomplete, in a very specific and perhaps intentional manner. The mythology describes Arceus as the first Pokémon, the entity from which all other things descended, the one who existed before the egg that contained the universe hatched into the shape of the world that Sinnoh's geography inhabits. The Hall of Origin, where Arceus waits, sits at the top of a staircase that rises above Spear Pillar, which is already the highest accessible point in the game, and the mythology treats this elevation as meaningful, as though the height of the location corresponds to the height of what it contains. But the mythology, as it is actually presented across the Pokédex entries and the Canalavu library books and the ruins of the region, does not say that Arceus created itself. It does not say that Arceus is without origin. It says that Arceus came from an egg, that the egg existed before the universe, and that when it hatched, the hatching created the conditions for everything else. What it does not say is where the egg came from. It does not say what existed before the egg, or whether anything existed before the egg, or whether the question of what came before a thing that came before everything is a question the mythology considers meaningful. This is not an oversight. The Sinnoh mythology is careful in its construction and has been refined across multiple game versions and supplementary materials with a consistency that suggests deliberate authorial attention. If the question of what preceded Arceus were meant to have an answer, the mythology would have provided one. The absence of the answer is the answer, which is to say, the mythology is explicitly comfortable with the proposition that the origin of origins is not something the mythology can reach. It stops at Arceus and the egg and acknowledges, by stopping there, that there is a wall at the back of the room it is showing you, and that the wall is not a failure of the room's design, but a feature of it. Arceus, in the games, carries this philosophical weight lightly, in the way that things which have carried a weight long enough eventually integrate it into the quality of their rest rather than the quality of their strain. It waits in the hall of origin with the patience of something that has no particular relationship to time, which makes sense given that one of the first things it created was the Pokémon that governs time itself. The Azure Flute event, through which the Hall of Origin was originally meant to be accessed in Diamond and Pearl, was cut from the final release, and the item was never distributed through legitimate means, which means that in the games as most players experienced them, Arceus was not accessible at all. The first Pokémon, the origin of the universe, waited in a room above the highest point in the world, and the game made no provision for reaching it. The mythology was fully present. The location was there. The event was in the data, and no one came because the mechanism for coming was withheld. There is something resonant about this, something that the Pokemon world's relationships to its own deepest questions seems to have established as a pattern. The origin of everything waits in a place you cannot reach by ordinary means. The path to it exists. It was built. It was simply never handed to the player, which makes it both more and less accessible than the things the game does hand to you, because the things you're handed are easy to overlook, and the thing that is withheld has had 30 years to grow in significance in the imaginations of the people who knew it was there and could not get to it. Canal City's library holds, in its upper floors, a set of books that the games allow the player to read, and that the games never require the player to read. They contain fragments of the Sinnoh mythology, presented in the form of old written records, the kind of documents that a world with a deep history would naturally accumulate in its oldest repositories of knowledge. The books describe things that the main narrative never corroborates directly. They mention a world before this one, a world that failed, a deity who caused the failure and was punished. They mention a Pokémon whose egg hatched at the beginning of time and whose body became the fabric of the world. They mention the sea, the sky, and the land as things that were made rather than things that simply are, and the distinction between made things and simply existing things is one that the mythology returns to repeatedly without fully resolving what it implies. These books are optional. Many players have completed the Sinnoh games multiple times without reading them, because the games do not tell you they are there and do not require you to engage with them in order to complete any objective. They exist as a layer beneath the game that the game offers to anyone who looks and withholds from anyone who doesn't, which is perhaps the most appropriate way to present mythology that is itself about the question of what lies beneath the visible surface of things. The mythology is the distortion world of the game's narrative structure, It is always there. It supports everything. Most people will never visit it. And the game has made its peace with that, the same way the world has made its peace with the fact that its foundation is something most of the things living on it will never think to look for. Every Pokemon region contains structures that were not built by the civilization currently inhabiting it. This is not an unusual feature of the game world. The franchise has always seeded its geography with evidence of prior occupancy, with ruins and inscriptions and chambers whose age cannot be precisely determined, but whose presence suggests that the world the player moves through is layered, that the grassroots and the gym towns and the friendly professors are a surface layer resting on something much older and much less decipherable. The ruins of Alph in Johto contain unknown, in patterns that correspond to an alphabet no contemporary institution can fully translate. The Salatian ruins in Sinnoh have chambers carved with the same alphabet, which implies a connection between regions across a distance that the game's geography and travel logistics suggest should make that connection very difficult to explain. Unknown are the most persistent mystery in the franchise's geographic distribution. They appear in Johto, in Sinnoh, in the Sevii Islands adjacent to Kanto. Their Pokédex entries cycle through descriptions that seem unable to settle on whether unknown are a kind of Pokémon with the appearance of letters, or whether they are a kind of letter that has the properties of Pokémon. The spell of the unknown film approaches the question of what unknown collectively are capable of, and reaches conclusions that the games have never quite endorsed or contradicted, leaving the specific question of unknown's nature in the ambiguous territory where the franchise keeps its most fundamental uncertainties. The ruins of Alph extend beneath the surface of the Johto landscape in ways that the game's map does not fully capture. The chambers accessible to the player are the chambers directly beneath the surface structure, but the depth of the ruins and the volume of unknown present in them suggests that the structure continues downward into the earth in ways that the game acknowledges without depicting. Kurt in Azalea Town, the Pokeball craftsman, references the ruins in terms that suggest a familiarity not just with their surface features, but with a history of them that extends further back than most institutional knowledge reaches. He does not elaborate. The ruins do not elaborate. They contain unknown in configurations that repeat certain patterns and resist easy interpretation, and they have been in the earth long enough that the world that built them is not the world that now overlooks them. The Tin Tower and the Brass Tower in Ekrutake stand in a different relationship to this deep history. They were built by people whose names the lore preserves, built for a purpose the lore describes, and damaged by an event the lore records. But they were built over a geography that the burned tower's basement reveals was already significant, already inhabited by the three Pokémon before they were named the legendary beasts, already connected to Ho-Oh through a covenant that predated the tower's construction. The towers are the most recent layer of a site that carries multiple layers of significance, and most of those layers are not accessible through any conventional means of exploration. The pattern across regions is consistent enough to suggest an intent behind it. Every region has its layer of the incomprehensibly old. Every region has its structures that resist the normal framework of explanation. And every region's map contains, if you look carefully enough, places where the world acknowledges that it was here before any of the currently visible institutions existed, and that what it was before those institutions is something it will share in fragments and withhold in bulk, offering enough to establish that the depth is real without offering enough to make the depth fully navigable. This is the Pokemon world's most consistent relationship to its own history. It shows you the edge of what is known and places the rest in the darkness beyond it, and it does not pretend that the darkness is any less real for being beyond reach. There is a character in the 5th generation Pokemon games who is introduced as the king of Team Plasma, the champion of Pokemon liberation, the leader of a movement built around the proposition that human beings should not keep Pokemon in Pokeballs, should not use them in battles, should not treat them as companions in a relationship defined by human need. His name is N, which is apparently short for Natural Harmonia Gropius, a name that the game reveals eventually, and that carries within its syllables a kind of gentle absurdity that is almost certainly intentional. He is, by the standards of his narrative role, a villain. He is also one of the most carefully and compassionately drawn characters in the entire franchise. N grew up in a room in Ghetsis' castle, isolated from human contact in a way the game later reveals was deliberate. Ghetsis, his adoptive father, constructed a childhood for Ian that was designed to produce a specific kind of person, someone who had been so thoroughly immersed in the company of injured and suffering Pokemon during his most formative years that he would arrive at adulthood with the genuine and unshakable conviction that the relationship between humans and Pokemon was fundamentally harmful to Pokemon. Ghetsis needed this conviction to be real and felt rather than manufactured, because N was intended to be the public face of a movement whose actual purpose was to use the appearance of Pokemon liberation to seize control of the regions by eliminating the trainer system. The conviction needed to be authentic, so Ghetsis made it authentic by building an entire childhood around its formation. N can hear Pokemon. This is the capacity that the game centers as the defining quality of his character, the thing that distinguishes him from other trainers, and that justifies, within the logic of the mythology, his role as king and his bond with Reshiram or Zekrom. He hears them the way that the game generally presents Pokemon communication as happening, not as language in the conventional sense, but as something closer to direct emotional transmission, the state of the Pokemon available to the person receiving it without the translation costs that human language normally imposes. This capacity is described in the games as rare, and as having developed from his isolated childhood, from spending the years when human children normally learn to interpret human faces, learning instead to interpret Pokemon states. What this means, and what the game treats with considerable care, is that the childhood Ghetsis, designed to produce a useful instrument, also produced a genuinely unusual person. The instrument had a self that grew alongside the purpose it was shaped for, and that self heard things. It heard Pokemon that were suffering, because those were the Pokemon Ghetsis made available to it during those formative years. It heard the specific register of pain and confinement, and it built from that register a framework of understanding that was both entirely genuine and entirely manipulated, because the understanding was real and the data that produced it was curated. N's convictions, it is true, it is also incomplete. It is true that some Pokemon suffer in human relationships. It is incomplete in that the suffering Pokemon were the only data his childhood contained. The game resolves this with a generosity that the franchise does not always extend to its antagonists. The player's Pokemon, encountered by N throughout the story, carry something different. They carry the specific quality of a relationship that is not defined by confinement or exploitation, but by whatever it is that happens between a trainer who genuinely cares and a Pokemon that chooses, within the limits of what choice means for a creature in those circumstances, to remain. N registers this. His certainty cracks, not because he has been defeated, though he is repeatedly defeated, but because the data he has been receiving for the entire story is adding new information to the framework his childhood gave him. The information does not resolve the question of whether training is ethical. It does not settle the debate. It simply gives him access to a register of the Pokemon relationship that his childhood specifically excluded. The story of N is the story of someone receiving a more complete dataset and beginning, slowly, to revise what the incomplete one had built. N's ultimate fate, his departure into the wild on the back of the legendary dragon, his absence from the 6th and 7th generations, his brief return in the sequel games, all of this is handled with the same care as his introduction. He is not resolved. He is not redeemed in the conventional sense. He is someone who has received new information and who is somewhere processing it, thinking about what it changes and what it doesn't, considering the childhood that made him and the question of whether what gets us built can be rebuilt into something that belongs to N rather than to Getz's purpose. This is not a story the franchise has finished telling. It is a story it left open, which is perhaps the appropriate thing to do with a character whose defining experience is the ongoing encounter with information that does not resolve cleanly into the framework already present. The 5th generation games are often discussed as the point in the franchise's history where the ambition to say something serious about the ethics of the franchise's core premise reached its most explicit articulation. The question Team Plasma raises, whether keeping Pokémon in Pokéballs and using them in battles constitutes a form of exploitation that the franchise's comfortable presentation of trainer culture has consistently declined to examine, is not a question the games answer. They present it, develop it through N's genuine anguish and the player's observed counter evidence, and then decline to resolve it. The credits roll and the franchise continues. Trainers continue catching Pokémon in the 7th, 8th, and 9th generations. No policy changes have been implemented. No official inquiry has been launched. The question was raised, given a full game's worth of attention and care, and then left in the air, where it has remained ever since, because it is the kind of question that the franchise cannot answer without fundamentally changing what the franchise is. This is perhaps the most disturbing mystery of all. Not a ghost who cannot find her way home, not a hollow legendary waiting in a frozen cave, not a missing child whose parents still pace an empty house, but a question about the world itself that the world asked aloud and then chose to continue ignoring. N heard the answer. The player characters heard the answer. Getz's was defeated and the liberation movement dissolved. And every generation of games since has resumed the practice of sending 10-year-olds into tall grass to capture wild Pokémon and put them in small spheres. And no one in the world the franchise depicts has picked up N's question and carried it any further. It sits there in the air above the Onova region, patient and unanswered, in the company of all the other questions this world has found more comfortable to leave unresolved than to address. The Pokédex is presented within the fiction of the games as a research tool. Professor Oak gives it to the player at the beginning of the first game and frames it as a device for recording data on Pokémon encountered during the player's journey, a scientific instrument in the service of a goal he describes as completing a comprehensive record of all Pokémon species. The device fills in its entries as Pokémon are encountered, and the entries it produces are supposedly generated from the data collected during those encounters, which would mean they reflect what is observable and measurable about the Pokémon in question. This framing cannot survive contact with the actual contents of many entries, and the gap between the framing and the contents is one of the most unsettling things in the franchise if you take the time to look at it directly. Many Pokédex entries describe things that could not have been observed by anyone who survived the observation long enough to record it. The entry for Gengar that notes it will lurk in the shadow of anyone standing in a darkened room, waiting for the moment to absorb their life force, is not something a researcher could have established by watching Gengar and surviving to write about it without the behavior the entry describes having been triggered. The entries for Spiritomb that describe its composition as the bound spirits of 108 people who committed wrongs in life imply a historical record that would require access to documentation the games do not establish as existing. The entries for Yamask state that each one carries a mask that is the face it wore when it was human, and that it sometimes looks at the mask and cries, remembering what it was. How was this determined? By whom? Under what circumstances did a researcher establish with enough confidence to include in an official scientific database that Yamask weeps for its former human self while holding what used to be its own face? The Pokédex is not a scientific document. It presents itself as one, and the franchise treats it as one within the fiction, but the content of the entries across every generation consistently exceeds what systematic observation and measurement could produce. Some entries describe events that occur over geological timescales, transformation processes that would require the observer to have been present continuously for periods measured in millions of years. Some describe internal states, emotional experiences, memories, desires, none of which are accessible through external observation. Some describe things that are described as happening, but that are framed in terms suggesting they have never been observed firsthand by anyone who then remained available to record the observation. The most plausible explanation, which the franchise never offers, but which the evidence strongly supports, is that the Pokédex entries are not research records at all. They are legends. They are the accumulated mythology of a world that has existed alongside Pokémon, long enough to develop oral and written traditions about them, traditions that may contain varying degrees of empirical accuracy and varying degrees of the creative embellishment that all long-standing oral traditions develop around their subjects. The professor who gave you the Pokédex may genuinely believe it is a scientific instrument, but what it contains is closer to what the ruins of Alf contain, the accumulated record of a much longer relationship than any individual researcher's observation could produce, passed down and modified and occasionally distorted, but carrying within it a core of something real enough to be consistently disturbing when you read it slowly enough to notice what it is actually saying. Consider the entry for Bennett, which says that it is an abandoned doll brought to life by a grudge against the child who discarded it, and that it wanders searching for that child. Consider the entry for Froslas, which says it freezes travelers who please it and keeps their bodies in its cave as ornaments. Consider the entry for Beware, which says it hugs people with a strength that snaps their spine and does this affectionately. Consider the entry for Mimikyu, which says that what lives beneath the Pikachu disguise is so disturbing that a researcher who saw it died from the shock. These entries exist in the same database as the entry for Bulbasaur. They are presented in the same format, with the same matter-of-fact authority, as though what they describe is simply the natural characteristic of a species that you should be aware of in the same way you should be aware of Bulbasaur's seed. The flatness of the format is doing a great deal of work. It is normalizing things that, extracted from their context and examined directly, describe a world that has developed an extraordinary capacity for accepting the extraordinary without being unsettled by it, which is either a form of wisdom or a form of collective denial so deeply established that it has become indistinguishable from wisdom at this distance. The Pokédex is perhaps the single densest concentration of the franchise's darkest implications, and it is the piece of the game that is most consistently overlooked because its format, the short entry read and dismissed as the player moves on to the next catch, actively discourages dwelling. The franchise knows this. It has always known this. The entries are written the way they are written because a longer format would demand more engagement with what they say, and more engagement might make the player put down the device and ask what kind of world this is, and who compiled this record, and how they could possibly know what they claim to know about creatures that on the evidence of the entries themselves should not have been surveyable without considerable personal cost to the surveyor. The flat format is the franchise's politest way of containing something it knows is not quite containable. The Pokédex is always there when you need it. What it says is always available, and whether you notice what it says has always been entirely up to you. The Pokémon world is not secretly a dark place, pretending to be bright. It is a bright place that has always understood its own foundations. The roots are warm because the burned tower is real. But before we allow that warmth to settle back over everything, there is one more place the darkness has not yet named. There is a question embedded in the first Pokemon games, so quietly that most players move through it without pausing, carried forward by the momentum of the gym challenge and the urgency of being 10 years old and newly empowered to walk into tall grass and discover what the world might offer. The question is this: the rival, the player's childhood neighbor, and the only other person in Pallet Town who receives a starter Pokemon from Professor Oak, begins the game with a team that includes a Raticate. The Raticate is present during early battles aboard the SS Anne, a cruise ship docked at Vermilion City. After the SS Anne departs, after the player moves north toward the next gym and the next stretch of world, they encounter the rival again in Lavender Town, specifically inside Pokemon Tower, which is a cemetery. The Raticate is no longer on his team. He has new Pokemon. He challenges the player, is defeated, says something dismissive, and moves on. The game does not address the Raticate's absence. It does not explain what happened between the SS Anne and the tower. It does not provide any alternative framing for why the rival is standing in a cemetery at the exact moment that his Raticate is no longer with him. The game shows you these facts in sequence and moves on, and the sequence has been suggestive enough that players have been drawing conclusions from it since the game's first released. The most discussed interpretation is the one the facts most directly support. The Raticate died. Whether it was injured in the battle against the player, whether the damage from that fight proved worse than it appeared, and the creature did not recover in the days that followed, whether it succumbed to something else entirely, the game does not specify. What the game specifies is that the rival is in a cemetery and the Raticate is gone, and the two facts stand next to each other in the world without any official commentary on what their proximity might mean. The rival does not weep, he battles. He asks whether the player knows what it means to keep going, even when everything collapses. He says he understands that now because he has experienced it. He leaves. The game moves forward. The Raticate is never mentioned again. What the sequence carries, beyond the specific possibility it suggests, is a portrait of the kind of grief that is processed entirely privately and expressed entirely indirectly. The rival does not say that his Pokemon died. He asks a question that could mean anything and means perhaps something very specific. He stands in the place where the dead are held and does not explain why he is there. The game places these elements in the world and trusts, or simply accepts, that many players will not assemble them, and for the players who do assemble them, the game offers nothing further. It does not confirm the interpretation. It does not comfort it. It simply leaves the sequence in the world and allows the silence around it to be exactly as heavy as it is. The rival's name is determined by the player. He has no canonical name in the original games. He is whoever you named him, which means he is both no one specific and every rival simultaneously. He grows into a champion. He stands at the peak of the Pokemon League with a team that is, by any measure, extraordinary, and that no longer contains the Raticate. Whatever he has carried from the tower to that summit, he carried it through every gym and every route between them, and the game ends when the player defeats him, and he is not seen again in that form. The cemetery is behind them both. The Raticate is nowhere in the building, and the game does not return to either of these facts, because the game has always understood that the most honest thing it can do with the things it shows you is show them and then let you decide how long to hold them. The friendships matter because loss is real. The champion you become is meaningful because the war that shaped the world you travel through actually happened and left actual marks. The ghost girl in Lumio's city does not diminish the beauty of the city of light. She is the reason the light is worth anything. Every bright thing in the Pokemon world exists in specific and meaningful contrast to a shadow that the world has not denied. That honesty, maintained across 30 years and dozens of titles and thousands of Pokédex entries, is one of the most quietly remarkable things any franchise has ever done. Another quiet detail becomes clear as we drift toward the end of this particular evening's journey. The mysteries we carry in the Pokemon world are not separate from the world's beauty, they are its foundation. The warmth is warmer because the loss is real. The friendships are more precious because the world they exist within has known exactly what it means to lose them. Every badge earned and every rival befriended and every Pokemon who reaches into its final evolution and stands there trembling with the newness of what it has become. All of it exists against the backdrop of the burned tower and the empty chair and the ghost who is still looking and the king who is still walking. Every Friday in the late afternoon, when the light in Sinnoh begins to take on that particular quality of the early evening, when shadows stretch long across the routes north of Floroma Town, and the windmills of the Valley Windworks turn with their low and continuous hum, something arrives that the locals have learned to anticipate without speaking of it directly. Two pale purple shapes, like balloons released at a celebration and forgotten, drift into the tall grass near the windworks, hovering at approximately the height a child might hold out their hand to reach. They arrive. They wait. The Pokédex says they are looking for souls to carry off, and the region has been watching this happen every Friday for as long as anyone can remember, without any official inquiry or resolution. Drifloon is a ghost and flying type Pokemon, and its classification as a ghost type is not decorative in the way that some typings feel slightly loosely applied to their subjects. Drifloon is, according to every Pokédex entry the franchise has produced about it across multiple generations, a creature composed in some meaningful part of the souls of people who have died. The Gold and Silver era Pokédex, which had not yet been written when Drifloon was designed, but whose entry style captures something about how the franchise thinks about these creatures, would have had a great deal to say about this. What the actual entries across Diamond, Pearl, and subsequent games say is precise and deeply strange. Drifloon appears before graves. It is attracted to the newly dead. It seeks souls, and when a child mistakes it for a toy balloon and takes hold of its string, it carries that child away. The entry does not say where. The Valley Windworks was built as a power generation facility. Large turbines drawing from the wind that moves constantly across the open fields of the Floaroma region. In the context of the main game, it is briefly occupied by Team Galactic, who are removed, and the Windworks resume their ordinary function and are never discussed again. What the game does not address, but what the lore establishes in the Friday mechanic of Drifloon's appearance, is that the area around the Windworks has a relationship with Drifloon that is regular enough to have become part of the local rhythm, the way some places have particular weather patterns or particular birds that arrive with a specific season. The Drifloon come on Fridays. The locals know this, but the children are warned. The warnings do not always take. The Pokédex entries across versions accumulate into something considerably more disturbing than any single entry suggests. In Diamond and Pearl, the entry describes Drifloon as grabbing the hands of children to drag them away, and notes that if a Drifloon is grabbed back, it shudders and shakes and makes a sound like something panicking. The follow-up versions describe it as composed of the souls of humans and Pokémon who died. The Platinum entry notes that it is born of gathered souls and floats in pursuit of more. The Black and White entries describe it as attached to people who approach it, which it does by seeking warmth in the cold, but that those who follow it rarely return. The accumulation is not accidental. Each generation adds one more quiet detail, one more note in a record that is building towards something specific. Driftbloom, the evolved form, carries the implications further in a way that removes any remaining ambiguity about what the creature is doing. Driftbloom is large enough to carry multiple passengers, and its Pokédex entries confirm that it does exactly this. It drifts upward, taking those it has gathered, and they do not arrive anywhere. The entries describe travelers disappearing, carried into the sky, and not seen again. The creature is the size of a small vessel, and it collects people, and it rises, and the people do not return. The game presents this in its flat, informational voice, the same voice that tells you a Bulbasaur has a seed on its back, and the flatness of the voice does considerable work in normalizing something that, extracted from its context, describes one of the most quietly horrifying things in the entire franchise. The Friday timing is one of the details that has generated the most discussion among those who pay close attention to these things. It is not an arbitrary day. In the context of the game world, Friday afternoons are when children are most free, when school has released them into the broad afternoon, and the routes outside town are full of the particular energy of children who have nowhere they are required to be for the next 2 days. Drifloon arrives precisely then. Whether this is because the creature has learned the habits of its preferred subjects, or whether the timing is tied to something older and more structural about the relationship between the creature and the day, the game does not say. It simply makes the timing consistent enough to have become part of how the area operates. People know, and knowing has not made the Drifloons stop coming. There are no named victims in the official lore, no children who are identified as having been taken, no parents who appear in the game's dialogue to mourn a specific loss that the Drifloon caused. The horror is held at the level of implication, presented in the Pokédex language, and the Friday timing, and the particular detail of the creature hovering at child hand height near a place where children are likely to be. This restraint is consistent with how the franchise handles its darkest material. It does not show you the consequence directly. It gives you all the components of a consequence and trusts you to assemble them without being told what you are building. The Strange House shows you the grief of parents and leaves the cause implied. The Lavender Tower shows you a ghost and leaves you to understand what it means that it cannot leave. The Valley Windworks shows you the creature and its timing and its height and its method, and then declines to narrate what follows. The distinction matters. The franchise is not being careless with this material or unaware of its weight. It is making a choice about how to hold something difficult, and the choice it consistently makes is to show the shape of the loss rather than the loss itself, to give you the components without assembling them into an image you cannot set down. This is a form of trust extended toward the audience, that what is suggested will register more deeply than what is shown. Drifloon is never shown taking anyone. The entries tell you it does. The Friday timing tells you it keeps doing it. And the game moves on to the next route, and the next trainer battle, and the next gym, and somewhere north of Floaroma Town, the windmills turn, and the pale shapes hover and wait, regular as weather, patient as the lore that built them. The Sinnoh creation mythology is one of the most fully developed cosmologies in the franchise, a layered account of origins that begins with a single egg in a void and unfolds through the creation of time and space and matter and antimatter, and eventually produces a world that functions because each of these elements is held in continuous balance with its counterpart. Arceus creates Dialga and Palkia, the embodiments of time and space respectively, and the three together establish the structural conditions that allow the world to exist and persist. This much is presented with relative clarity across the games, accessible through the creation tablets in the ruins of the Pokémon League and the mythology the region has accumulated around Mount Coronet. What is presented with considerably less clarity is what happened to the third legendary created alongside Dialga and Palkia. Giratina was created to embody antimatter. Its role in the cosmological structure the Sinnoh mythology describes was to be the counterpart of the ordinary material world, the shadow presence that gives the world of matter its definition by existing in necessary opposition to it. In this framing, Giratina is not a mistake or a deviation. It is an essential component of the structure, the negative space, that allows the positive space to have meaning. Without something against which the ordinary world defines itself, the ordinary world would lack the boundaries that make it a world rather than a formlessness. Giratina was supposed to be this thing, and in structural terms, it performs this function. It exists in the distortion world, the inverted reality that underlies the ordinary one, and it holds there without complaint, and the world above continues to be what it is in specific relation to what Giratina holds beneath it. What Arceus did, according to the mythology, was banish Giratina to the distortion world. The reason given, in the fragments of the lore that are available to the player, is violence. Giratina was violent in the place before the world was fully formed, and Arceus responded by separating it from the ordinary world and confining it to the antimatter realm it was meant to embody. This framing troubles the mythology more than it resolves it, because it raises a question that the games open and then do not fully close. If Giratina was created to embody antimatter, is its violence a failing or a feature? Was Arceus correcting an error in Giratina's character, or was Arceus surprised to discover that a being designed to represent the opposing force in a structure built on opposition would demonstrate oppositional qualities in its behavior? The distortion world is one of the most distinctive environments in the franchise. It is a place where the ordinary rules of physical orientation do not hold. Surfaces exist at angles that have no relationship to any consistent gravity. Water flows without direction. Platforms and land masses float in arrangements that the ordinary world would not permit. The visual language of the space is the visual language of a world in which the assumptions underlying ordinary physical existence have been suspended, and navigating it requires abandoning the spatial intuitions that the rest of the games have built into the player's experience of moving through Pokémon environments. It is disorienting in a way that feels deliberate. Giratina lives here. Giratina has lived here since before the ordinary world above it was finished being formed. The question of what Giratina experiences in the distortion world is one the franchise gestures toward without fully addressing. The Pokédex entries describe it as watching the ordinary world from the dimension it inhabits, which implies a relationship to what it has been separated from that goes beyond simple containment. Giratina is not simply imprisoned in the distortion world. It is observing the world it was excluded from, tracking it from below, maintaining some form of awareness of the surface it will not be permitted to return to without significant interference. This is a particular kind of sentence. Not darkness and oblivion, but proximity without access, the ability to watch something you cannot touch, to be constitutively adjacent to a world you can observe but never fully inhabit. The Platinum version of the Diamond and Pearl games expands the Giratina narrative in ways that complicate the simple reading of banishment and isolation. The Torn World, as it is also designated, connects to the ordinary Sinnoh through certain portals, and Giratina moves between them with a purposefulness that does not suggest a creature simply enduring its exile. It has the origin form, a sleeker, more serpentine form it takes when existing within its own dimension, and the altered form, the more angular and structured shape it presents when crossing into the ordinary world. The two forms suggest a creature that has adapted to the conditions of its dimension rather than simply persisting within them unchanged, which implies a form of life rather than a form of punishment. a creature that has made something of the space it was given, even if it was given that space involuntarily. The relationship between Giratina and Cyrus, the Team Galactic villain of the Sinnoh games, adds another layer to the mythology. Cyrus seeks to destroy the current universe and create a new one without spirit, without emotion, a world reduced to pure form and logic, without the chaos that living beings with feelings introduce into any structure. His plan involves the power of the creation trio, and when it threatens to restructure the cosmological architecture that the distortion world depends on, Giratina intervenes. It pulls Cyrus into the distortion world directly. The implication, which the games leave to the player to assemble rather than narrating explicitly, is that Giratina recognized the threat to the structure it inhabits and acted to neutralize it in the manner available to it. By removing the agent of disruption from the world above and placing him in the world below, where Giratina can watch him in the way it watches everything else, from down there, close, but not able to reach the surface, contained within the antimatter dimension, while the world he intended to unmake continues above him. Cyrus's fate in the distortion world is not resolved in the games. He is there. He is presumably still there. A man who sought to eliminate all feeling, all spirit, all the qualities that make existence recognizably alive, is spending what may be eternity in the company of the most ancient and isolated Pokémon in the franchise, in a dimension where the laws of the ordinary world do not apply. Whether this is justice, punishment, irony, or simple plot convenience, the games do not say. They leave Cyrus in the distortion world with Giratina and return to the surface, and the surface continues, and down beneath it, in the inverted space where surfaces meet at impossible angles and water flows without direction, the two of them persist in whatever arrangement the encounter between them has produced. This is what the Sinnoh mythology contains at its foundation. Beneath the straightforward champion defeating story, the game presents to the player who is not paying attention to the creation tablets and the Pokédex entries and the spatial language of the distortion world. A creator who made a being for a structural purpose and then banished it when that being demonstrated the qualities inherent to its purpose. A world that is held in place by the continuous presence of something that the world has decided it cannot face directly. A creature that watches from below, patient and ancient, keeping the structure intact by occupying the opposing position without complaint, doing the work of the antimatter that makes the matter meaningful. This is a cosmological architecture with genuine philosophical weight. It is the kind of thing that rewards attention in proportion to how carefully it is given. There is a moment in the original Pokémon Red and Blue that players who are moving quickly through the game might not notice, and players who are moving slowly through it will find deeply strange. The player arrives on Cinnabar Island by way of the sea or the cave routes, depending on their approach, and what they find is a volcanic island with a gym, a laboratory, and a set of ruins that the game seems to regard as unremarkable background detail. The ruins are the shell of what was once a larger facility, and inside that facility, scattered across the floor of rooms that have been burned and broken and left without formal acknowledgement in any dialogue the game provides, there are journals. The journals document the creations of Mewtwo. They do this in the matter-of-fact voice of scientific record-keeping, the voice of someone noting observations and results and anomalies in the way that anyone recording the progress of a research project would. There is no dramatic framing around the journals. No character in the game points the player toward them or warns them about what they contain. The player finds them in the ruins of a building that no one in Cinnabar seems to want to discuss, and reads them, and the journals reveal that what happened in those rooms was the thing that the anime would later present as the origin story of the franchise's most famous legendary Pokémon, but presented here without the narrative scaffolding of the film, without the emotional framing, without the music that accompanies the theatrical version of the same events. The journal entries begin with the discovery of Mew. A researcher finds a fossil, or what is described as a fossil, of unusual composition, and from this material extracts what the journals call amplified cells. The experiment is described in terms that are deliberately imprecise, the way early stage research is often described before the specific terminology has been settled on, and the imprecision makes the thing being described more rather than less unsettling. Something was extracted from something that had been found in the wild. That extracted thing was amplified. From the amplification, something began to grow. The journals document the growth across multiple entries, tracking the development in the same tone a researcher might use to track the development of any experimental organism, and the accumulation of those entries produces, by the time the player reaches the end of the record, the full weight of what was done in those rooms. The entry that has been quoted most often in discussions of the Pokémon lore reads simply, "The Pokémon has awakened. We have created the world's most powerful Pokémon." The entry that follows it is not calm in the same way. It describes the Pokémon as expressing a will. It describes the facility as being damaged in a way that implies the damage was not accidental. It describes the research team as having lost contact with the Pokémon, which is a clinical way of saying that the thing they made in a broken building on a volcanic island in the south of the Kanto region decided it was not going to remain where it had been placed and left, and the people responsible for placing it there were not subsequently available to describe what the departure looked like. The ruins on Cinnabar Island are the aftermath of this. The burned rooms, the scattered journals, the gym that sits in the middle of it all, as though the catastrophe that preceded its construction was not something that required any particular acknowledgement. The gym leader Blaine has a connection to the laboratory, hinted at across various media adaptations, that the original games do not make explicit, but that the context makes difficult to avoid inferring. He is a scientist as well as a gym leader. He is on the island. The laboratory is on the island. The laboratory is where the franchise's most powerful and most troubled legendary Pokémon came into existence. The games do not ask Blaine what he knows about any of this, and Blaine, who in some versions of the story has a direct personal connection to the project, does not volunteer it. Gold and Silver introduced a development that raised new questions about the island without resolving the old ones. When the player returns to Cinnabar Island in the Johto games, the island is gone. The volcano has erupted in the interval between the events of Red and Blue and the events of Gold and Silver, and the eruption has submerged the lower portions of the island under lava and sea. The gym has relocated. The laboratory is now definitively inaccessible, buried under volcanic rock, the journals with it. Whatever they contained, the physical evidence, is now under the island, under the sea, held in the geological record of a volcano that erupted on an island where researchers once made something that broke out of containment and disappeared into a world that was not prepared for it. The timing of the eruption is not explained. The games present it as a natural event, a volcanic island doing what volcanic islands do over long enough timescales, and nothing in the official text connects the eruption to the events in the laboratory. But the laboratory is gone, and the journals are gone, and the island that held the most concentrated evidence of what the Cinnabar researchers did is now covered in the kind of material that most effectively prevents any investigation from recovering what was buried. The geography of the aftermath looks from a certain angle exactly like what the aftermath of a very thorough erasure would look like, not because the eruption was caused deliberately, but because the effect of it, regardless of cause, is that the record was destroyed, the facility was destroyed, and the island that contained them was reduced to something that can no longer be entered or examined or used to establish what actually happened there. Mewtwo still exists. The Pokémon that was made in those rooms is in the world, somewhere, having survived the departure from the facility, and the absence of any of the structure the researchers might have imagined would contain or direct it afterward. The first film frames Mewtwo's subsequent years as a period of genuine anguish and identity formation of a powerful being trying to understand what it is and why it exists and who made it and what that making obligates either party to. These are not small questions. They are the questions that any consciousness might ask about its own origins, except that Mewtwo's origins involve a burned laboratory and a set of journals and an erupted volcano, and the understanding that the people who made it did not consult it about whether it wanted to be made. The question of what Mewtwo owes the world that created it, and what the world owes Mewtwo for creating it without consent, is not one the franchise has ever answered. It has been sitting on Cinnabar Island, or rather underneath where Cinnabar Island used to be, since 1996. There are structures in the Pokémon world that function as records. Not records in the sense of documented archives, not the kind of deliberate preservation that a library or a museum represents, but records in the sense of accumulated material evidence, the way that geological strata record the sequence of what happened and in what order, without any agent having arranged for the recording to occur. The ruins of Alph in Johto are this kind of structure. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is this kind of structure. The ancient ruins of Hisui that persist into the present day of Sinnoh are this kind of structure. What they record is not always legible. What is legible is not always comfortable to understand. The ruins of Alph contain the unknown, a species of Pokémon whose design is an alphabet and whose relationship to language and meaning has been generating careful and inconclusive scholarship within the franchise since they first appeared in the Gold and Silver games. Each individual unknown resembles a letter, and each letter corresponds to a character in an ancient script that the ruins also contain in the form of carved panels on the walls. The panels, when translated, tell parts of stories that the ruins themselves do not fully complete. References to ancient peoples, references to specific events, references to the unknown themselves, which raises the question of whether the panels were written about the unknown by people who encountered them in the ruins and recorded what they found, or whether the panels were written by the unknown, in which case, what the ruins of Alph contain is a library assembled by creatures that are themselves words, a species that is both the alphabet and the user of the alphabet. The sign and the signer collapsed into the same entity. The psychic field that the ruins of Alph emit is detectable by the equipment the games reference, and felt as a quality of the space by anyone who moves through it carefully enough. The unowned cluster there, and the clustering has been consistent enough across the observable record that the ruins must have been inhabited in this way for a very long time, certainly longer than any of the current scholarly institutions in the Pokémon world have been studying them. What the unowned are doing in the ruins is not clearly established. The language of the franchise around them is carefully inconclusive, suggesting that the unknown may be a species whose presence predates the current form of the world, or may be a species that was involved in the creation of the world's current form without committing to either claim. The uncertainty is not accidental. The unknown are the franchise's most explicit gesture toward the possibility that language and reality have a relationship that goes deeper than the functional one most residents of the Pokémon world operate within. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is a record of a different kind. It is a record of loss, specifically of the losses of Pokémon who have died, accumulated across the years of the settlement, and formalized into a structure whose purpose is explicit rather than archaeological. People come to the tower to mourn. They bring the Pokémon they have lost to be interred there, and the spirit of the institution is the spirit of acknowledgement, the formal recognition that what was here is no longer here, and that the absence deserves to be marked. This is, in the context of the franchise, a significant act. The games present the human Pokemon relationship as one of the most important relationships in the world, and the Pokemon Tower formalizes the understanding that this relationship ends, that Pokemon die, that the individual beings who form specific bonds with specific trainers do not persist indefinitely, and that what this calls for is not denial, but the specific ritual of communal mourning. The ghost that blocks the upper floors of the tower in the original games is a Marowak who died before her time and cannot complete the transition between the living presence she occupied and the remembered presence the tower is designed to hold. This is what the tower's purpose encounters when it fails, when the loss is too sharp or too recent or too specific to move through the ordinary process of acknowledgement and transition. The ghost is not a failure of the tower's function. She is evidence that the function is real, that the transition the tower exists to facilitate is an actual process with an actual direction and an actual outcome, and that some losses resist that process because the specificity of what was lost does not dissolve easily into the general category of mourned and honored and settled. The Marowak ghost had a child. The child is below the tower, or was below the tower, or is somewhere in the world still wearing the skull. The bond was too specific. The process could not complete. Team Rocket's presence in and around Lavender Town in the original games introduces a dimension to the Pokemon Tower's character that the games do not fully develop, but that the accumulation of details makes difficult to ignore. Team Rocket is a criminal organization whose operations involve the capture and exploitation of Pokémon without the relational context that the main narrative presents as the appropriate framework for the human-Pokémon relationship. Their presence near the tower suggests a specific kind of disregard, an inability or unwillingness to recognize what the tower represents, to acknowledge that the beings whose remains are interred there had the kind of individual existence that makes the formal marking of their absence appropriate and necessary. The Ghost and the Rockets occupy the same space for a portion of the game, and the contrast between what the tower means and what Team Rocket represents is part of what gives the Lavender sequence its particular emotional texture. The Game Boy music of Lavender Town is the most discussed piece of music in the franchise's history. The original composition, designed for the small speaker of the original hardware, produced a quality that players encountered and described consistently as wrong, as carrying something inside it that registered at a level below the musical. The theories about the specific frequencies involved, the urban legends about the effect of the music on young listeners, the elaborate creepypasta narratives that grew up around the track in the years following the game's release, all of these are not the point. The point is that the music does something, and that what it does is appropriate to the place it accompanies. Lavender Town is a town that exists to mark loss. Its music was composed to carry the weight of that marking. The sense that something in the music is not quite right is the sense of a place that holds the record of every Pokemon mourned within its tower's walls, and the weight of that record is audible to anyone who is paying the right kind of attention when they enter its range. There is a question that runs underneath the entire franchise, present in every game and every episode and every trading card and every Pokédex entry, never asked directly by any character within the fiction, never addressed in any official statement by any professor or researcher or league official. It is the question that N spent his entire childhood accumulating evidence for and his early adulthood beginning to complicate, the question that the Cinnabar journals brush against when they describe the awakening of what was made in those rooms, the question that every Pokédex entry about an emotion or a memory or a desire is contributing to whether the entry is aware of contributing or not. What exactly is a Pokémon? Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, There's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again. The Pokemon world is still out there, patient and full of questions, waiting for whoever comes next.